An immense rock, cold to the touch, which never reaches the top. The rough hands, sweat dripping, and human strength challenging the impossible. That is Sisyphus' punishment: push an endless stone, just to see it rolling back towards the abyss. But it is not the rock that shudders us, it is not the physical effort that catches us. It is the eternal return, the nonsense. It is the condemnation of repeating without reaching, of fighting without winning. Sisyphus is not just a man in Greek mythology. It is the echo of humanity itself, the awkward reflection found in the days that seem not to advance, in dreams that escape just when we are about to touch them. Each generation has felt, in one way or another, the weight of its own rock. Maybe that's why Sisyphus has never disappeared from our minds. He is always there, in the shadow, reminding us that there is nothing more human than the effort against the absurd. Imagine it! A man who challenged the gods, mocking his laws, playing with death as if he were a simple pawn in his game. Sisyphus' cunning had no limits. He cheated Zeus, tied Thanatos, manipulated Persephone. Every action of his overflowed such a shameless ingenuity that he seemed almost admirable. But ambition is priced, and the price of Sisyphus was the cruelest of all, an eternity without purpose. Who has not ever felt the frustration of seeing his efforts to collapse like Sisyphus' rock? It is a sensation that cuts the air, which squeezes the chest. No matter how much you try, the result is still the same. And yet, Sisyphus does not give up. There is, every day, every hour, taking the rock again. Pushing it with a force that does not come from the body, but from the soul. It is in that act where the true power of its history is, a force that resists time and sneaks into our culture, in our words, in our lives. The ancient Greeks looked at this story with warning eyes. Sisyphus was the example of what could happen when a mortal challenged the gods. But over the centuries, something changed. It was no longer just a punishment. In their fight, in that repetitive effort, some saw heroism. Others saw hope. Albert Camus, with his incisive pen, turned Sisyphus into a symbol of human resistance against the absurdity of existence. His rock ceased to be a weight and became a purpose, in a way of facing a world that does not always make sense. The stories never end where we think. A rock that falls rolls again, and thus, the myth of Sisyphus continues to turn in our imagination. He has inspired writers, philosophers, artists, and dreamers. It has appeared on canvases, in books, in theaters, and even in songs. Because Sisyphus is not just a figure of the past, it is a constant presence in our present. Every time someone faces an endless challenge, every time an effort seems useless but persists anyway, there is Sisyphus, reminding us that even in the absurd there is beauty. It doesn't matter if you look like a hero or as a fool condemned by his own ambition. What matters is that its history has a beat, a pulse that resonates with every step we take. What would you have felt Sisyphus at the time the rock touched the ground, just before starting again? Was it frustration? Was it resignation? Or was there a flash of challenge, a thought that said, today, even for a second, I will get higher? The Ephyra hills rose majestically under a sky that oscillated between blue and sunset fire. There, where the earth was with the sea, a city was born that would carry the seal of a man whose name would resonate over time, Sisyphus. But this was not a common land, nor its founder a simple mortal. Ephyra did not rise with the blessing of the gods, but with the cunning and ambition. Sisyphus did not need swords to win battles, his words were enough. On more than one occasion he managed to get his enemies they were among them, while he watched from the heights, calculating his next movement. When Ephyra began to get up, his walls seemed unbeatable, not because of their height or by force, but because behind them was Sisyphus, the man who could foresee every threat. But its greatness did not solve only in protection. Ephyra quickly became a trade center. The ships arrived loaded with goods, and the markets were filled with voices and colors. Every currency that circulated in the city was a reminder of its ruler's ingenuity. However, there was something else in Sisyphus, something that separated him from other kings from his time. He did not rule with the weight of a motionless throne, but with the restlessness of someone who always looked for more. Each street, each port, each stone placed on the walls carried its brand. His ambition had no limits. If the gods looked from Olympus with disdain, he didn't fear them. Ephyra would not be a divine gift, but a challenge to his authority. And so, while the city grew, so did the shadow of its ruler. Not all myths talk about this, but Ephyra people knew him well. Sisyphus was not only a king, he was an architect of destiny. His intelligence shone with intensity, but it was also dangerous. There were those who whispered that it was not prudent to look too much from a man who could even fool the gods. At night, under the stars that illuminated the gulf, Sisyphus walked through the walls of Ephyra. What did you see? The result of his genius or the beginning of his own perdition? Maybe both. His mind never rested, always urging the next step, always one step ahead of his enemies and, sometimes, even of himself. Before Sisyphus became the king of Ephyra, before his hands touched the rock that would define his eternity, his blood already carried an extraordinary legacy. He was not a common man, his lineage was intertwined with the very essence of the gods and the heroes. Sisyphus not only inherited a name, but also a destination woven by the whims and passions of Olympus. The tradition that his father was Elo, the god of winds, a being whose emotions could shake the seas or calm the storm. Elo, lord of the invisible currents that cross the world, was more than a god, it was an elementary force. And in that volatile nature was the Sisyphus root. Because, although his father dominated the chaos of heaven, Sisyphus inherited something deeper, the ability to control, not with force, but with the mind. From his mother, Enaretta, they say he had a beauty that could rival the dawn, but also a cunning that many underestimated. She was not a simple passive figure in Olympus's stories. Some whisper that it was she who instilled in Sisyphus that penetrating look, that instinct to anticipate the movement of the pieces before they moved on the dashboard of the destination. In their lineage the winds of Elo, human passions, and divine ambitions were interwoven. Each thread of its ancestry formed a complexity that few could decipher. He was a descendant of gods, but not a slave to his will. Sisyphus did not see its ancestors as models to follow, but as challenges to overcome. However, the divine legacy had a weight that Sisyphus could not ignore. The gods watched Elo's children with interest and disdain. They knew that the blood that ran through their veins was marked by ingenuity and arrogance. It was no accident that Sisyphus, Salmono, and the other descendants of Elo were constantly in the spotlight of Zeus. His lineage was as bright as dangerous, a living reminder that even mortals could sometimes look at the skies with challenge. Sisyphus was aware of that power that flowed inside. But I also knew that it was not enough to have a divine lineage. So that the names of their ancestors mean something, it had to build their own legacy, one that the gods could not erase. In his veins he carried the winds of ambition and cunning. It would not be a sheet dragged by the currents, it would be the cyclone to define its own path. Thus, while the blood of the gods conferred or a connection with the Olympus, Sisyphus used it not to worship, but to challenge. Every decision he made, every word he pronounced, carried with him the weight of his ancestry and the shadow of a man who was not willing to give in to the fate that others had drawn for him. They say that even as a child, Sisyphus had something in the gaze that made others nervous. It was not the typical curiosity of a child who wants to understand the world, it was something deeper, something disturbing. His eyes not only looked, they calculated. It was as if he were always looking for the perfect angle, the way to take advantage of any situation, however small. The first stories of his childhood have the mixture of amazement and distrust that only someone like him could inspire. In Elo's house, his father, where the winds roared as invisible guardians, Sisyphus already stood out among his brothers. While the others were content with games and mischief, he watched, listened. He seemed to understand things that nobody else perceived. If someone lost a toy, he found him, but he didn't return it without asking for something in return. If someone argued, he was the first to calm the situation, but always with a hidden plan behind his reassuring words. One of the best-known stories of his childhood speaks of a day when heaven suddenly darkened. The winds of Elo were uncontrolled, and the people of the region feared that the gods were furious. While everyone was looking for refuge, Sisyphus, just a boy, walked towards the top of a hill, where the winds were stronger. He sat there, with a tranquility that bordered the insolence, and waited. When his father found him, shouting that he retired, Sisyphus simply smiled and replied, "The winds are yours, but I know how to talk to them." Elo, intrigued, asked him to explain. Sisyphus pointed out how the leaves revolved in the air, how the winds were intertwined with each other. If you listen to them, they tell you where they're going. You just have to learn to interpret their whispers. That night, Elo looked at his son with a mixture of pride and fear. Because Sisyphus had not only demonstrated an extraordinary understanding, but had done something even more shocking: he had faced chaos without fear. On another occasion, it is said that a merchant arrived in the region, seeking refuge. He brought with him a chest full of wealth, but he didn't trust anyone to protect him. Sisyphus, who was not yet enough to be considered a threat, offered his help. "Leave it with me," he said with a voice that inspired confidence. "No one will suspect a child." The merchant, desperate, accepted. But when returning the next day, he found the empty chest. Sisyphus was sitting next to the chest, with an innocent expression. "The winds must have taken it," he said, shrugging. It was never known what happened to wealth, but since then, no one underestimated Elo's son. There was something magnetic in his personality. Even when he stole or cheated, he did it with such a skill that it was impossible not to admire him. His brothers tried to imitate him, but lacked their natural ingenuity. He not only played to win, he played to make sure that others did not even understand how they had lost. Sisyphus was also skilled with words. The adults used to forget that they were talking to a child when he participated in the conversations. His arguments were so logical, so precise, that he often left the greatest words. But it wasn't just logical. I knew how to appeal to emotions, how to use the weaknesses of others to achieve their goals. There was a moment, however, that marked the difference between the child and the man who would challenge the gods. It was a quiet night, under a clear sky, when Sisyphus, just a teenager, asked his mother, "Why do the gods look at us from above as if we were toys?" Enaretta, surprised by the question, tried to give him a simple answer. But Sisyphus interrupted it. "If the gods can be deceived, then they are not so different from us. And if they are not so different, why should we obey them?" It was just a fleeting thought, a spark in the mind of a young man who still did not know the weight of the consequences. But at that moment, something changed. He was not just a cunning child, it was someone who saw the world as a board, and the gods, like pieces that could move. What followed was no accident. It was the beginning of a destiny that he began to forge with each word, with each action, with each deception. The history of Sisyphus and the gods do not begin with an open challenge, but with an exchange, a game where the rules seemed clear but were destined to break. The gods, from their Olympus, watched mortals with a mixture of condescension and curiosity. And Sisyphus, with its unique cunning, saw in them not untouchable, but adversaries to those who could manipulate if he played his cards well. The first great episode that placed him in front of the gods occurred when Ephyra began to bloom under his government. The sacrifices, offerings and rituals were currency between mortals and gods. Humans offered wealth and devotion, and the gods responded with blessings and protection. But Sisyphus, always calculating, did not see the relationship as something sacred. For him, it was a negotiation, an opportunity to win something without giving too much in return. On one occasion, the fields of Ephyra suffered a devastating drought. The crops died under the scorching sun, and the despair seized the people. The priests cried out for a sacrifice to Zeus, an offering that appealed his anger and brought rain to the dry earth. Sisyphus, seeing the fear in the eyes of his people, decided to intervene. He summoned the priests and ordered them to prepare a great ceremony, one that attracted Zeus's attention. But, in secret, he gave precise instructions. The animals that would be sacrificed should be the oldest and most sick, those that no longer served at all. In addition, the wealth that were offered should be simulated, painted pieces of wood to look like gold. "Zeus is too far to notice the difference," he said with a smile that disarmed any objection. The ceremony was majestic, with songs and dances that filled the air of Ephyra. The priests, although restless, followed their king's orders. And, surprisingly, the rains arrived shortly after. The people celebrated, convinced that Zeus had accepted their offering. But Sisyphus knew the truth. It was not the will of the gods, but a coincidence that he had manipulated to maintain control. It was not the only deception. On another occasion, Poseidon, the god of the seas, demanded a tribute from Ephyra in exchange for allowing his ships to cross the turbulent waters without danger. Sisyphus accepted, but instead of delivering the promised assets, he sent a message full of flowering words that praised the greatness of Poseidon. "The gods do not need our wealth," he wrote. "Only our unwavering devotion." Poseidon, flattered by the words, allowed the ships to continue, without knowing that he had been deceived by the skillful pen of Sisyphus. But not all gods were so easy to manipulate. Hades, the lord of the underworld, began to suspect the rumors that reached him. They said Sisyphus had managed to avoid the death of several of their subjects, using tricks and traps to prolong their lives beyond what fate had decreed. For Hades, this was a serious offense, a challenge to the immutable laws that governed the universe. Sisyphus, of course, I didn't see things that way. For him, death was just another barrier that could be raffled with enough ingenuity. When Thanatos, the god of death, came to look for him, Sisyphus received him with impeccable hospitality. He invited him to dinner, offered him wine and kind words. And while Thanatos relaxed, Sisyphus chained him, caught in a prison from which he could not escape. During that time, no mortal died, and the soul stopped arriving at the underworld. It was a chaos that Hades soon noticed. The gods, enraged by deception, managed to free Thanatos, but not before understanding the magnitude of the challenge that Sisyphus represented. It wasn't just a cunning mortal, he was someone willing to make fun of the divine laws, to face the power of Olympus with a smile on his lips. Sisyphus knew that his time was exhausted. The gods did not forget, and their patience was not infinite. But even at that time, he did not regret. For him, every deception, every broken pact, was a victory, a proof that even the gods could be defeated by human cunning. And although he knew that inevitable punishment in him, he also understood that, in his game with the immortals, he had already left a brand that they could not erase. In the hills where Ephyra raised, Sisyphus was much more than a king. He was the architect of a vision, a strategist whose mind seemed to weave possibilities where others saw obstacles. The city, which was once more than a modest settlement, became a lighthouse of prosperity and ambition under its government. But the greatness of Ephyra did not arise by divine work or by a blessing of Olympus, it was the result of the unwavering cunning of its ruler. Sisyphus understood something that other kings ignored: true wealth was not only in gold or lands, but in alliances, trade, and narrative control. From the beginning, he identified the strategic potential of Ephyra. Its location, near the Gulf of Corinth, made it a key point for maritime trade. The ships that crossed those waters carried valuable goods, spices, fabrics, precious metals. But until then, nobody had managed to take advantage of that flow with stint of rich. Sisyphus changed that. He ordered to build a safe port, with solid docks and wide stores where merchants could save their goods. But it was not only the infrastructure that attracted merchants, it was his ability to negotiate. He offered incentives, low taxes, protection for their ships, and even a market in which everyone, regardless of their origin, could trade freely. Ephyra will be the heart of trade, he proclaimed, and fulfilled his word. However, not everything was diplomacy. Sisyphus also knew that control required strength. The hills that surrounded Ephyra became natural strengths, reinforced with walls that seemed impenetrable. From those heights, their sentries could see any threat long before it arrived in the city. But their true weapon were not the swords or arrows, it was the information. Sisyphus had spies in every corner of the kingdom and beyond. I knew who planned a rebellion, who hid riches, who could be persuaded or intimidated. His network of informants was so extensive that some said that he knew the secrets of the gods. And although this was, in large part, a myth, it was not far from the truth. His ability to anticipate the movements of his enemies was almost supernatural. The stories about his ingenuity became legends. Once, a neighboring king threatened to invade Ephyra, demanding tribute in exchange for not attacking. Sisyphus, instead of giving in, sent emissaries with alliance gifts and promises. Meanwhile, he spread rumors that Ephyra had received the blessing of Poseidon and that God would punish anyone who tried to attack the city. The king, fearful of divine anger, withdrew his troops. When he discovered the truth, it was too late. Ephyra had strengthened and was out of reach. Sisyphus also understood the value of appearance. Under his command, the city was embellished with squares, temples, and markets. But these were not simple ornaments, each structure served a purpose. The temples, although dedicated to the gods, were actually symbols of the richness and power of Ephyra. The markets attracted merchants around the world, and the squares were places where the people could meet and feel that they were part of something bigger. Although many venerated him as a fair and wise leader, there were those who knew his darkest side. Sisyphus did not hesitate to use questionable methods to maintain its control. If someone challenged his authority, he disappeared without a trace. Those who tried to betray it soon discovered that their plans were known before even being executed. But even these ruthless acts were carried out with such precision that few dared to question it openly. Despite its hardness, the people of Ephyra admired him. Under his government, no one was hungry, the streets were safe and wealth flowed like an inexhaustible river. The elders told stories about their cunning, and the young people dreamed of imitating their ingenuity. But Sisyphus never allowed the complacency to settle in his heart. There was always a new challenge, a new obstacle to overcome. At night, while the city slept, Sisyphus walked through the walls of Ephyra, watching the horizon. He knew his prosperity had a price. The gods watched, always attentive, always waiting for an error. But he didn't fear his gaze. In his mind, he was already planning the next movement, one more step towards a future that only he could imagine. One dark night, he hovered on Ephyra, with the clear sky and the stars flashing as if they were vigilant eyes. In a corner of Olympus, Zeus, king of the gods, had committed an act that preferred to keep in the shadows. He had kidnapped Aegina, the beautiful daughter of the Asopo River, taking her away from her father and any mortal who could challenge her authority. For Zeus, this was nothing more than a whim. For Sisyphus, it was an opportunity. The story tells that Asopo, furious for the disappearance of his daughter, wandered for the earth looking for clues. His despair was palpable, and his pleas resonated as an echo in the valleys. He finally arrived in Ephyra, where Sisyphus, as always, watched the chaos with a calculating mind. It was well known that Asopo had the power to control rivers and fountains, and for Sisyphus, the promise of constant water for its dry city was a more valuable treasure than any gold. When Asopo approached the king, asking for help to find his daughter, Sisyphus did not hesitate. He knew who was responsible, because his spy network, and perhaps a little luck, had revealed Zeus's secret. But he did not offer it immediately. He thought about it, evaluated the risks and benefits. Finally, he spoke with a smile that mixed sympathy and cunning. "I know the culprit, but knowledge has a price. If you make the sources sprout in Ephyra forever, I will tell you where to find Aegina." Asopo, despair or unwilling to anything, he accepted. And so, Sisyphus broke the tacit code that kept mortals and gods in their respective places. He pointed out the sky and revealed that Zeus had taken Aegina to a distant island. Asopo did not waste time. He ran to the right place, with his fury flowing like the river he ruled. Meanwhile, in Ephyra, the waters began to flow. The thirsty lands revived, the fields flourished, and the people celebrated the ability of their king. But Sisyphus knew that this victory had a price. Zeus did not forgive the betrayals, and this would not be the exception. When Zeus knew what Sisyphus had done, his anger was so great that the heavens trembled. The rays fell on the earth, and his voice resonated like a thunder that seemed to break the world into two. It was not just the betrayal that enraged it, it was the challenge. Sisyphus, a simple mortal, had dared to reveal the secrets of the king of the gods. Zeus sent Thanatos, death personified, to take Sisyphus to the underworld. But this is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because Sisyphus, faithful to its nature, did not plan to accept its destiny so easily. He received Thanatos with courtesy, pretending resignation. While inviting him to share a banquet, he studied every movement of God, every weakness. At the right time, Sisyphus cheated Thanatos and chained him, catching him in a prison that no divine force seemed to be able to break. During the time that Thanatos was a prisoner, no mortal died. The earth, strangely, was filled with life, but also with chaos. Patients who should have departed languished in their beds, warriors who should have fallen into battle continued to fight, and the souls destined for the underworld did not find their way. Zeus, enraged and now also worried, had to intervene. He sent Ars, the god of war, to free Thanatos and restore order. Sisyphus, although temporarily defeated, did not show regret. He had achieved what no mortal before him. He had humiliated to the gods and challenged the laws that governed the cosmos. But Zeus had not ended with him. The betrayal of the divine secrets was an offense that would not remain without punishment. In the shadows, Sisyphus could feel the weight of his next confrontation with the gods, but he was not afraid. For him, every step was a play on a larger board, and he was already planning his next movement. The waters continued to flow in Ephyra, a blessing obtained at the price of a monumental challenge. The people saw their king as a hero, but the heavens hovered on him as a reminder that Zeus's wrath was patient, relentless, and was far from ending. On an afternoon of scorching heat, where the air on Ephyra seemed to undertake like a mirage, a story that would change the course of his life came to the ears of Sisyphus. Aegina, Asopo's daughter, had disappeared without a trace. The river, which until then had flowed calmly, began to stir with a fury that reflected the despair of its god. It was a whispering secret, a rumor that only a few knew. Zeus, in his incessant search to satisfy his wishes, had abduced the young woman. Sisyphus, with his penetrating gaze and always alert, saw in this event more than a divine drama. Where other mortals would have felt fear of the mere mention of the name of Zeus, he saw an opportunity. Aegina's abduction was more than an impulsive act of the gods, it was a crack in the Zeus armor, a vulnerability that could be exploited. It was not long before Asopo arrived in Ephyra, overwhelmed with fury and pain. Its waters roared, threatening to flood the nearby lands if no one gave them answers. When meeting Sisyphus, his despair was evident. The king, observing him calmly, understood that the pain of a father was a force that even a god like Zeus could not control. "What do you know about my daughter, mortal?" Asopo asked, his voice rumbling like an overflowing river. Sisyphus, with its characteristic control air, pretended to surprise first, as if meditated on the dilemma of God. Then, slowly, he let out a truth that burned like the sun on the dry earth. "Your daughter," he said gently, "was taken by Zeus to a distant island. He hides her, far from your eyes and anger." Asopo, initially incredulous, looked at the mortal with narrowed eyes. The revelation was daring, almost suicidal. But the conviction in Sisyphus' tone left no doubt. It was then that the river offered a deal. If Sisyphus guided him to his daughter, he would guarantee that Ephyra never suffered droughts. It would sprout springs in every corner of the city, feeding the life that depended on them. The pact was sealed, and Sisyphus, with a deliberate gesture, he said towards the horizon. "There," he said, "on the island of Aegina, you will find your daughter." Asopo did not wait. Transforming into a furious torrent, advanced towards Elto Island. The calm that had preceded his departure broke instantly. Sisyphus knew that the act he had just committed would not be unpunished. Betraying Zeus was not a minor act, it was to challenge the divine hierarchy itself. While the god river approached his destiny, Zeus, from Olympus, felt the movement of the waters. It was not only the flow of the river that captured his attention, but the intention behind them, the fury of a father willing to face him. At that time, Zeus understood that someone had revealed their secret. And he didn't need much to guess who. The wrath of God fell on Ephyra as a relentless storm. Rays crossed the sky, illuminating the city as if it were noon. But Sisyphus, instead of hiding, remained firm in its walls, observing the heavenly show with a mixture of challenge and serenity. He knew that Zeus would come for him, but he also knew that God was not infallible. When the storm finally ceased, an Olympus messenger appeared before Sisyphus. It was Hermes, the fast and cunning herald of the gods, who brought a clear message. Zeus demanded an explanation. Sisyphus, with a calculated smile, responded without hesitation, "I just did what any king would do for his people. I secured Ephyra's prosperity. If Zeus considers that a crime, that comes to face him with me." In the Olympus, Sisyphus' response enraged Zeus even more. But he also intrigued him. This mortal had not only challenged his authority, but had done it with a confidence that few gods possessed. At that time, Zeus made a decision. I would not punish Sisyphus immediately. It would let its apparent victory settle, that arrogance grew in its heart, before unleashing a punishment that would be remembered for generations. Meanwhile, Asopo had found Aegina. The island where Zeus hid her became a battlefield between the river and the raptor. Although Zeus managed to escape with his intact reputation, the act of Sisyphus was recorded in the memory of the gods as an unprecedented betrayal. Sisyphus, meanwhile, continued to rule Ephyra with a cunning that only seemed to strengthen. The sources promised by Asopo sprouted throughout the city, and the town acclaimed it as a hero. But on silent nights, when the moon shone on the hills, Sisyphus knew that the battle with the gods had not finished. He had won this game, but the game was just beginning. And at the heights, Zeus expected the perfect moment to move his next piece. Zeus's wrath was not like the fury of a mortal. He did not yell or gestured, it was a relentless, silent power at first, like the sky before a storm, but devastating when it was unleashed. When the king of the gods knew that Sisyphus had revealed the whereabouts of Aegina to Asopo, the tension in Olympus became palpable. The air seemed heavy, the minor gods avoided crossing with Zeus, and the clouds swirled around their throne, loaded with rays and thunder. But Zeus did not act immediately. That was the mark of his anger, lethal, but patient. He watched Sisyphus from the heights, studying each of his movements, looking for a way to punish him in a way to resonate in all eternity. What was most angry was not only betrayal, but the challenge. A mortal had dared to expose it, not with brute force, but with words and cunning. Meanwhile, in Ephyra, Sisyphus showed no signs of fear. He had made his play and had won her. The waters flowed in their city, the fields flourished, and the town acclaimed him as a king who had achieved the impossible. But inside, I knew that the real challenge was not yet arrived. He was not naive, he knew the gods enough to understand that Zeus did not forget or forgive. The first sign of Zeus's wrath came with a storm. It was a night when Ephyra's sky illuminated with rays that fell near the city walls, as if Zeus himself were marking the territory. Thunder resonated so strong that the windows broke, and the people ran to hide in their homes, fearing the worst. But Sisyphus, instead of taking refuge, went up to the highest tower of his palace and observed the heavenly fury with a disturbing calm. "If you want to destroy me, do it now," he murmured in the wind, as if talking directly to Zeus. But nothing happened. The rays continued to fall, but none touched the palace. Sisyphus's challenge was an act of courage or, perhaps, of pure arrogance. The next day, a messenger arrived in Ephyra. It was Hermes, the herald of the gods, with his winged helmet and his shining caduceus. He entered the palace without announcing, and his gaze, normally jovial, was seriously dyed. "Zeus is furious," he said bluntly, "and demands an audience with you." Sisyphus smiled, as if the news was nothing more than a simple inconvenience. "Tell Zeus that if he wants to talk to me, he can come himself. My obligations as king do not allow me to leave Ephyra." Hermes looked incredulously, but also curious. It was rare to find mortals so challenging. Without saying more, it disappeared in a flash of light, carrying the insolent response to the Olympus. Zeus received the message with a mixture of surprise and fury. For a moment, he wondered if this mortal was crazy or if he really had a plan. But Zeus's pride did not allow him to ignore the challenge. However, he decided to wait. Punish Sisyphus immediately would be a victory for the mortal, a confirmation that he had managed to disturb the king of the gods. No, Zeus planned something much worse: let Sisyphus feel the illusion of victory, just to snatch it at the cruelest moment. In the days that followed, life in Ephyra continued normally, but Sisyphus was always alert. He had one time, yes, but he knew that Zeus was patient. Every decision he made as king was calculated, not only to strengthen his city, but to protect himself from any divine attack. The people, oblivious to the tension between their king and the gods, continued to venerate it. For them, Sisyphus was a hero, a man who had challenged Zeus and left unharmed. But Sisyphus knew that the true battle was not fought in the squares or in the fields, but in the invisible margins between mortals and the gods. One night, while walking alone at Ephyra's walls, looking at the horizon, Sisyphus felt something strange. It was as if the air was loaded with electricity, as if someone were watching it. He did not be scared, but his mind began to work. If Zeus was playing patience, he would do the same. The direct confrontation had not yet arrived, but the tension was palpable. Zeus waited for the perfect time to act, and Sisyphus, with his ingenuity as the only weapon, prepared for the inevitable. The gods were powerful, yes, but even they had weaknesses. Sisyphus just needed to find them before the storm reached it. In the turquoise waters that surrounded the city of Ephyra, where the waves crashed into the rocks with an almost human force, another of the cunning deceptions had perfected over the years. This time, his goal was not a god or a hero, but a minor god, a living river with the fury of a father, Aesop. The river god, who had been stripped of his daughter, Aegina, was not only devastated, but was also easily manipulated by pain and the desire for revenge. And Sisyphus knew it. It all started when Aesop, in his desperate search to recover his daughter, arrived in Ephyra. His thirst for justice was as strong as the waters he ruled, and his anger for the rapture of Aegina by Zeus took him to the city hoping to find answers. He was not just a desperate father, but also a god with the power to overflow the rivers and submerge entire cities if he was disobeyed. But Sisyphus, far from fearing him, saw a tool in him. The king of Ephyra had a skill that few understood: absolute control over the moments, about the words, about the psychology of those around him. Aesop, blinded by pain, did not see the trap that Sisyphus was weaving in his mind. When the river god appeared before him, his voice was a bass roar, full of despair and fury. "Sisyphus! You must help me find my daughter. Zeus has taken her, and you know it." The words resonated on the walls of the palace, and the echoes of the anger of Aesop seemed to shake even the ground under the feet of Sisyphus. Sisyphus, as always, was calm and serene. His eyes shone with a cunning light as he listened to God's supplications. He knew that the key was not just to reveal the truth, but also to offer him something that made him feel that he was obtaining great power, an advantage in his search. If Sisyphus showed Aesop that he could help him, the river god would be willing to do anything for him. And that was exactly what I wanted. With a slow and thoughtful gesture, Sisyphus told Aesop, "I know where Aegina is. But what I offer you is not just her whereabouts. I offer you something more important, the absolute control of the waters. What do you tell me if I help you, and in return, do you make an eternal place of abundance, where springs sprout incessantly, where the lands never suffer more for drought?" Aesop, as expected, was tempted. The promise of control over rivers and sources was irresistible for a god whose strength came from the waters dominated. Sisyphus, knowing that his word was the last one that the god of the river wanted to hear, he continued, "I not only give you the location of Aegina, but I offer you the opportunity to avenge you of Zeus himself. The island where he hid her is vulnerable. You act quickly, you could strip him of his precious reward." The Aesop River, overflowing with fury and passion, accepted the deal. "I will help you keep the city prosper. I will help you with the fountains, but first, give me what you have promised me." Sisyphus, without escaping a single smile, revealed the location of the island where Zeus had taken to Aegina. "You go there and you will bring it back. But don't forget what we have agreed. My lands will be under your protection and your waters will be eternal." As Aesop left for his mission, Sisyphus watched in silence. He had done more than a simple treatment, he had manipulated the desire of a god and made him a pawn in his game. At that time, he had not only won time, but he had also established a power channel in his favor. While Aesop left for the island, Sisyphus allowed a slight sigh of satisfaction. He knew that the river god, blinded by his revenge and his anger, was not aware of the true nature of his mission. "I wasn't looking for Aegina just to rescue her, I was looking to destroy Zeus." And while he did, Sisyphus would have won not only the control of the waters, but the loyalty of an angry god. And so, when Aesop returned, after having fulfilled his mission and having achieved what Sisyphus had anticipated, the river of the god would be under his domain. The waters, which only flowed by their nature, would now undergo the orders of the king of Ephyra, who had made God believe that he was the owner of the situation. But it was not so. As always, Sisyphus had taken the reins of destiny, using the pain of a father and the revenge of a god as pieces of a larger board. In the following days, the sources sprouted in Ephyra with a force never seen before. The fields were filled with life, and the prosperity that Sisyphus had promised the people materialized with amazing speed. Meanwhile, the goddess Opo, believing that his revenge against Zeus would be fulfilled, he did not know that he had been dragged into a network of deceptions that placed him exactly where Sisyphus wanted, under his control. The death of Sisyphus, or rather, his first death, was as unexpected as it is inevitable. No one could have imagined that the most cunning man of all time would finally be caught by the same hands as all mortals feared, the cold and inexorable hands of Thanatos, the god of death. However, at the time the fate reached it, Sisyphus was not defeated. No, it was not his mind that failed, but his arrogance. It all started in Olympus, where Zeus, finally tired of the tricks and deceptions of Sisyphus, decided that the time had come to put an end to his cycle of challenging the gods. Thanatos, the god of death, received the order to take Sisyphus to the underworld and make him pay for his crimes. However, what Thanatos did not know, what even the gods underestimated, was that Sisyphus would never be delivered without a last play, without a final trick. The arrival of Thanatos to Ephyra was not a solemn or gloomy event, but an event that was dyed for Sisyphus's audacity. When the god of death crossed the doors of the city, he did not find the king on his throne or in his palaces, but on the shore of the river, where the waters seemed to whisper secrets to the winds. Thanatos, with his sharp scythe, approached Sisyphus, who looked at him with a quiet, almost mocking smile, as if he had already anticipated his visit. "I come for you, Sisyphus," Thanatos said in a serious voice, causing the air itself to freeze. "Zeus has decreed your end. You can't fool more." But Sisyphus, as always, did not flinch. He looked at the god of death with a disturbing calm, his mind working at an inhuman speed. "To fool me? That would be an insult to my intellect, Thanatos," he replied, and with a glowing look added, "I have not earned such a simple, so direct. But maybe we can make a deal, don't you think?" The god of death, accustomed to obedience and fear, frowned. "A deal? What kind of treatment could a mortal like you?" Sisyphus, with his cunning to the limit, smiled with the confidence that only he possessed. "I propose a challenge, Thanatos. If you manage to capture me, I will do what you ask me without more resistance. But if you get me to give my man of word." Thanatos, baffled but intrigued by the challenge, he accepted. Death, after all, had never had to negotiate, but something in the words of Sisyphus aroused a question in him. He thought this game would be fast, like the destiny of all mortals. Nothing is further from reality. Thus, the god of death tried to arrest Sisyphus, but this, with his agility and quick mind, was always one step forward. When Thanatos tried to arrest him, Sisyphus slipped between his fingers as water, always escaping for a second, for a loophole, mocking his power. Every time the god of death thought he had won, Sisyphus found an exit, an answer, a trick. I was in his nature. While Thanatos was frustrated, the king of Ephyra laughed inside. Finally, Thanatos, exhausted by the effort and overflowed by the challenge, decided to use his scythe to arrest Sisyphus to catch someone who really deserves it. "A mortal like me can be too much for you. What will you do when you are caught in this trap?" The words, simple and full of mockery, were not just an insult, but a psychological game that worked like a spell. While Thanatos hesitated, Sisyphus took the opportunity to chain the god of death in his own chains, using a hidden mechanism he had devised for that exact moment. In the blink of an eye, Thanatos was caught, unable to move, without being able to escape. The god of death, who had never been challenged, was now a mortal prisoner. Sisyphus, with a triumph smile, looked at Thanatos and said, "Now, we will see what happens when death itself is trapped in her own game." Sisyphus' power was such that even the gods feared what he had done. While Thanatos remained captive, death itself ceased in the deadly world. No one died. The souls of the dead were trapped, erring in eternal life, unable to cross the threshold towards the underworld. The balance sustained by the world was broken, and all living beings began to fear the consequences. However, Sisyphus' victory was ephemeral. The gods, outraged by such daring, soon intervened. Zeus, in his fury, sent Hermes to free Thanatos and restore order in the cosmos. Death returned, relentless and fierce, but not without Sisyphus having delayed it, delaying its destiny for a time. At that moment, Sisyphus knew that he had challenged the cosmos, that he had touched the limits of his own existence. But he also knew something else, that, although the gods could defeat him, they would never do it without a last trick, without a last play. The world had ceased to be what we knew. Death, which had always been the inevitable shadow that accompanied life, was no longer present. Instead, a rare and bleak silence reigned. Sisyphus, in his infinite cunning, had achieved the unthinkable. He had imprisoned Thanatos, the god of death, and with that he had altered the course of existence itself. However, what seemed like a victory for the king of Ephyra soon became a conviction for all living beings. At first, people did not understand what was happening. Life continued their course, the fields were still cultivated, the children grew up, the old aged, but nobody died. At first, this was seen as a blessing. Parents looked relieved to their children, knowing that they would not have to suffer the loss of a loved one. The soldiers returned victorious of the war, without fear of falling on the battlefield. No one thought about death, since their presence had vanished. But over time, something began to change. Life, which had previously been beautiful precisely because of its fragility, began to lose its value. The men and women of the cities began to feel trapped in an eternal youth, without the possibility of resting or freeing themselves from the weight of existence. The bodies began to deteriorate, but they didn't die. The wounds never healed at all, the bodies were filled with pain without the final release offered by death. The weight of life became increasingly unbearable. In the villages, the elders looked sadly how their bodies could no longer maintain the rhythm of eternal youth. There was a feeling of vacuum in their hearts, an anguish to know that they could not rest, that their bodies would continue to get older, breaking, without anything could relieve that wear. Nature itself seemed to have altered. The stations no longer had the same cadence, the trees did not drop their leaves, since the final cycle did not arrive. The earth no longer rested in winter, and the days were extended forever. The dead erred aimlessly, trapped in limbo, unable to find peace, waiting to cross the threshold towards the underworld who never arrived. The souls of those who had died, trapped in an intermediate state, wandered without hope. They mixed with the living, trying to communicate, but the living no longer listened to them. The sun shone tirelessly, but its light only accentuated despair in the eyes of those who no longer knew if they were alive or dead. Sisyphus, who had believed that his trap was a victory, began to feel the effects of his own deception. Every day that passed, the weight of eternity became more evident. The streets of Ephyra, formerly vibrant with laughs and cell drunks, now they were full of empty faces, with eyes that did not know where to look. People, at first grateful for eternity, soon realized that living without the possibility of dying was a curse, an unbearable burden. The men became indifferent. Love or passion no longer mattered, because nothing could end. Couples lived together for centuries, but their hearts cooled because the desire for separation no longer existed. The wars no longer ended, the conflicts were eternalized, and the soldiers fell, but they got up, only to fall again. The land itself began to complain about the eternity imposed by Sisyphus. The fields that previously produced abundant life began to wilt, the trees no longer paid for juicy fruits, and the earth became sterile, unable to sustain the weight of an endless life. The gods, observing the rupture of cosmic balance, began to fear for the future. Not only mortals suffered, but the nature of the universe was falling apart. The gods of Olympus, aware that death was necessary for the flow of the world, knew they should restore order. But doing so involved confronting Sisyphus, something that none of them wanted. They knew that the king of Ephyra was cunning, that his mind was able to find an exit even from the worst scenarios. But they also knew they had to act, or the entire world would collapse under the weight of eternal life. In Ephyra, meanwhile, Sisyphus walked through empty streets, listening to the echo of his own steps. The man who had challenged the gods, the mortal who had manipulated death, was now trapped in his own creation. Death, which had been his greatest enemy, was also his greatest ally. But now, having retained it, Sisyphus realized what he had done. He had sentenced everyone to an endless life, a life without rest. Eternity was not a gift, It was a prison. The inhabitants of Ephyra no longer looked at him as their king, but as responsible for their suffering. Fear, despair, and anxiety were reflected in their faces, and tears fell incessantly, without the liberation that only death could bring. The heroes who had once faced monsters and gods, now looked at themselves as empty shadows, trapped in the same endless routine. And so, the world without death, that Sisyphus had dreamed that it was a blessing, had become its worst nightmare, a nightmare that would reach it later, when the gods decided to restore order irreversibly. The air in Olympus was loaded with a tension that no one could ignore. The gods, usually in their world of immortality and power, were now seen surrounded by a disturbing silence. The constant rupture of the cosmic balance by the imprisonment of Thanatos had altered the natural order of the universe. Death, the most fundamental and universal concept, had been trapped, suspended in the limbo of eternity. And everything had been the work of a mortal, Sisyphus, who, in his arrogance and cunning, had dared to challenge not only the gods, but to his own destiny. Zeus, the king of the gods, was furious. He had silently observed how the mortal world crumbled under the weight of eternity, how living beings, deprived of death, had fallen into a meaningless existence. Without the possibility of liberation, life had become an unbearable burden, a conviction disguised as a blessing. The rivers no longer flowed with the same force, the crops began to die, and the order of the cosmos was gradually disintegrated. It was time to act, to restore balance, to make Sisyphus for his boldness. In Olympus, Zeus summoned the other gods, his palpable fury. "This mortal has altered the course of everything we know," he said, his voice echoing in the farthest corners of his palace. "He has challenged the gods and, worse, has imprisoned death itself. It's time to end his game." However, not everyone in Olympus were willing to intervene so quickly. Athena, with his unparalleled wisdom, raised his voice against Zeus. "We must consider the consequences of what we are going to do. Sisyphus has shown to have an acute mind. If we punish it without thinking, we run the risk of creating an even greater chaos. But, without a doubt, it must be stopped." But Zeus did not listen. The fury of a god who had been challenged by a mortal could not be ignored. Thanatos had been released only by his order, and his imprisonment had broken the very essence of life. "I have had patience, Athena, but this mortal has crossed the line. The trial must be impartial. It is time to restore order, without further contemplation." With a gesture of his hand, Zeus ordered that Thanatos be released. Without expecting more, the god of death was unleashed from Sisyphus' chains. There was no more the time for doubts, or more space for negotiations. Death should return to the deadly world, and Sisyphus had to pay the price of having altered the nature of things. Thanatos, released from his prison, felt a wave of being able to travel his being. The energy of death, which had been contained for so long, flowed again through it. With a dark look and a shining scythe, he headed towards the underworld, knowing that his mission would not be easy. But now, with the support of Zeus, his destiny was sealed. Meanwhile, in Ephyra, Sisyphus was in the palace, observing the horizon. For days, he had felt a disturbing feeling in the air, a kind of omen. His mind, always alert, detected that something was about to happen. "I couldn't help it, I knew that death, although trapped, wouldn't leave it for a long time. His triumph, although great, was only temporary." And then, the time came. Zeus appeared before him, with a presence that made the same ground tremble. "Sisyphus, the time of your games is over," he said, his firm voice like thunder. "You have challenged the gods, you have believed that you are bigger than death. But everything has a price, and now it's time for you." The king of Ephyra, knowing that his destiny was sealed, showed no fear. Only a look of challenge crossed his face, a spark of recognition in the eyes of who knows that he has been defeated, but does not regret his actions. "Do you really think you can stop me, Zeus? Do you really think that death is more powerful than cunning?" But Zeus, with a penetrating look, did not respond. In his hand, lightning shone with a blinding intensity. "It is not cunning that moves the world, Sisyphus. It is balance. And you have broken that balance. Death cannot be stopped, not for you, or by any other mortal. Death is inevitable, and now it returns to the world. With a single gesture, Zeus invoked the power of divine justice. The ray unleashed, not in a deadly blow, but in an action that annulled the Sisyphus trap. Thanatos, with the strength of his scythe, appeared next to Zeus, ready to execute the sentence. The king of Ephyra, who had believed to have control of his destiny, saw how his world began to crumble before him. There was no escape, there was no cunning that could save him now. Sisyphus was caught again, not because of physical death, but for the acceptance that his time had arrived. Zeus, with a gesture of absolute power, banished him to the underworld, where, once again, the king of Ephyra would be condemned to push his rock, again and again, for all eternity. The cunning that had characterized him could no longer save him, and his punishment became the reminder that not even the gods are above the laws of the universe. Zeus's trial had restored order, but the lesson was clear to all that no mortal, however cunning, could challenge the natural course of things without facing the consequences. Death, time and fate were still forces beyond human understanding. And Sisyphus, no matter how bright, would not be the exception. The underworld was a place where shadow and darkness were intertwined, where the echoes of lost souls eternally resonate. However, Sisyphus did not fear shadows. For him, fear was just another illusion that vanished before his sharp mind and his cunning nature. The punishment that the gods had imposed on him was cruel: to push a gigantic rock towards the top of a mountain, just to see how it fell again and again, without end. But as always, Sisyphus would not accept a destination that could not manipulate. When he was finally dragged into the underworld, where his destiny seemed sealed, he did not show a glimpse of repentance. On the contrary, the certainty that his punishment was just another obstacle that he had to overcome, fed his spirit. The doors of the underworld closed behind him, and there, in the kingdom of Hades, the king of the dead looked at him with contempt, since he was a soul more trapped in eternal pain. But Sisyphus didn't stop. It didn't matter how much it would have been defeated, its cunning would never rest. It was now Persephone, the queen of the underworld, who maintained control over the convicted. She, with her cold and implacable gaze, witnessed how the souls of the dead were judged and destined for their respective punishments. It was on his throne, in the heart of the underworld, where the destinations were sealed. And it was her, Hades' wife, whom Sisyphus had to face if she wanted to have any opportunity to escape. At first, Persephone watched him in silence, as a god who did not see in him more than a simple mortal. But soon, the presence of the king of Ephyra, with his bold look and poise, intrigued her. There was something in his position, in his way of walking, that made her think that this man, although convicted, was not someone common. Sisyphus, by noticing your int-s, did not miss the opportunity. He approached the queen with an arrogant, almost mocking smile, and began his trick. "Majesty Persephone," Sisyphus said with a soft voice, loaded with honey and sweetness, "I know that my destiny here is sealed, but I dare to make a proposal. Have you not tired of seeing the convicted suffer forever? Wouldn't you want, for a single moment, change the rules?" Persephone looked at him with distrust. What could a simple mortal in the underworld? The gods knew there was nothing that could change the course of the dead, much less someone like him. But there was something in his words that lit a spark of curiosity. "What can you offer me that I haven't seen?" He replied with a cold voice, although he could not avoid a slight inclination of his head. "What I offer you, my queen," Sisyphus said, with a cunning smile, "it is the opportunity to challenge the norm. I propose a treatment that will benefit both. Let me return to Earth for a brief period, just a moment, to correct a pending issue that I have left unsolved." Persephone, who did not usually trust anyone, but still felt a curiosity about Sisyphus's behavior, observed it carefully. The king of Ephyra had been playing with the rules of the universe for so long that it seemed that he had a power over them. The idea that a mortal could make such an offer, and that it could even influence the kingdom of the dead, was tempting. "And if you do not fulfill your word, Sisyphus," Persephone finally said, in a voice full of threat, "what do you think will happen with you? You will be nothing more than a wandering spectrum, without a body or soul, wandering through the endless darkness." Sisyphus, with an unwavering calm, replied, "If I do not fulfill my word, then that my soul was trapped in this underworld for all eternity. But if you trust me, I assure you that you can see that neither death nor the gods can restrict the power of a man like me." Persephone, intrigued by her audacity and, perhaps, for her disdain for eternal punishment, nodded. The temptation to see how far Sisyphus could go was too strong. "It's fine," he said, in a serene voice, "I will grant you what you ask." He returns to Earth, but remember, death awaits you here, and you will not be able to escape from it for a long time. Sisyphus, without losing a single moment, accepted the offer of the Queen of the Underworld and, with a mocking smile, left the Underworld and returned to the world of the living. He knew that time played against him, but he also knew that he had cheated Persephone, and that, at least for a while, death would not be his immediate destiny. But time, as always, became his worst enemy. Sisyphus's life, outside the Underworld, was extended, and the promises he made vanished with every day that passed. The gods, at first incredulous, began to realize what had happened, and the consequences of Sisyphus' deception soon became evident. The deception in the Underworld had been an act of pure cunning, but had also marked the beginning of an even greater suffering. Sisyphus had avoided his destiny, but at a cost that would accompany him forever. Death, although delayed, would always find its way. But in the meantime, the king of Ephyra had once again demonstrated that neither the gods, nor death themselves, were safe from his ingenuity. Sisyphus' return to life was not a celebration. No one in the world of the living, neither mortals nor the gods, received it as a hero. No one applauded his victory or provided for his cunning. On the contrary, his return was marked by silence, a disturbing calm that indicated that, although his escape from the Underworld had been a personal triumph, the consequences of his acts could not be ignored. When Sisyphus stomped again the land of the living, something had changed in him. The world seemed more distant, colder. Although his body was still the same, a part of his soul had been left behind, trapped in the shadows of the Underworld. The time that had passed there, facing his punishment and mocking the gods, had left a deep mark on his being. He was no longer the same man who had ruled Ephyra with cunning and arrogance. Eternity in the Underworld had marked him, and now he walked through the world of the living with a disturbing feeling of vacuum, as if death itself had touched it, but had not claimed it. Sisyphus, however, was not consumed by despair. His mind, as skilled as ever, began to look for ways to recover his power. He knew that his time outside the Underworld would not be long. The gods did not forgive, and death, although she had been deceived once, she could not be mocked forever. However, while he was free, he would take advantage of every moment. He returned to his kingdom of Ephyra, the city he had ruled with a firm hand, but now he looked at her from a new perspective. He was no longer the arrogant king who had manipulated the gods for his own benefit. The city, which once had prospered under its government, seemed smaller, more insignificant. On his return to Ephyra, Sisyphus realized that people no longer saw him with the same eyes. He was not the wise and persuasive ruler who once had been, but a man who had challenged the cosmic forces and paid the price for it. The people, although owed a lot, felt a mixture of fear and confusion to see him again. They knew that he had cheated the gods, but they also knew that no one, not even him, could escape his destiny forever. Despite the cautious looks, Sisyphus tried to rebuild his life. He took the reins of the kingdom again with the same cunning of yesteryear, but this time there was a difference in his way of governing. He no longer trusted the invulnerability of his mind. He knew that the forces he had challenged were not allowed to defeat himself so easily. The gods, although they had allowed their temporary return, would not forget the humiliation that had caused them. Sisyphus lived the following years in a kind of uncertainty, knowing that his life would not last much more, but without being able to do what he did better, challenge the impossible, manipulate the world around him. The nights were filled with restless thoughts. The echoes of the Underworld echoed in his mind, and although he was in the world of the living, death never moved too far. Sisyphus was increasingly caught between the desire to escape his destiny and the certainty that he could not avoid it. He was aware that death stalked him, waiting for the cycle to be completed, but in the meantime, he clung to life with the same intensity with which he had challenged the gods. But, despite his cunning, his return could not be eternal. Time, that old enemy, finally began to reach it. Although he could fool mortals, the gods were always observing, waiting for their opportunity to restore balance. Sisyphus knew that, sooner or later, death would claim him again, but in the meantime, he continued to defy inevitability with his eternal ability to overcome fate. In his heart, he felt that he had won more than a simple victory over the gods. He had gained awareness that, at least for a short time, he could challenge the order of things. But the return to life had also left it marked by a feeling of vacuum. Every moment of freedom was a reminder that his destiny would never be truly his. The years in the underworld, the evidence, the escape, everything had been part of a game that could not win. The suffering of his eternal destiny had been recorded in his soul. And while life in Ephyra continued its course, Sisyphus walked through its streets, knowing that, although momentarily free, death would always return for him. The weight of eternity, which had been his punishment, was now his existential burden. In the background, Sisyphus understood that the true prison was not the rock that had to push incessantly, but the fact that he had been sentenced to live with the awareness that, no matter how much he tried, it would never be free. Life escaped between his fingers, a gift that he could not appreciate completely because he was always looking towards death, which expected him, that stalked him with infinite patience. Thus, Sisyphus lived, not as a free man, but as someone who, despite his intelligence and cunning, had understood that true punishment was not the rock or mountain. The real punishment was to live in constant waiting, in constant tension between life and death, knowing that there would never be a happy ending, but also knowing that he could not stop fighting his destiny. And while doing so, the world continued its course, indifferent to the anguish he carried. Sisyphus, with his challenging gaze and his indomitable spirit, had not understood the magnitude of the sentence that the gods had imposed until he saw her with his own eyes. The rock, so huge and so heavy, seemed an extension of his destiny itself, a condemnation that could not evade. It had been misleading to think that life, however limited it was, could offer some relief. Now, before the burning sun and the infinite sky, the reality was unwavering. Again and again, it had to push that rock, just to see how it fell again and again. There would be no end, there would be no rest. Sisyphus' eternal punishment was not just a matter of physical pain. The rock, heavy and cold, represented the burden of hopelessness that would accompany each of its days. Sweat soaked his resent while fighting her to the top of the mountain, but as soon as she reached almost at the top, the weight of the rock dragged her down again. And there, at the bottom of the mountain, its endless fight began again. Every time I felt I could achieve it, the rock denied it, showed him that nothing in this world could be completely his, not even the effort. The gods watched from the top, from their imposing heavenly throne, where the glow of divine justice was blinding. They had deliberate long and lying on Sisyphus' punishment. Hades, the lord of the underworld, was not satisfied with the humiliations he had suffered. Zeus, with his supreme authority, could not allow someone as a Sisyphus to challenge the laws of the universe so openly. The king of Ephyra had mocked his destiny, he had upset the cosmic order with his intelligence, his cunning, and his unwavering will to avoid everything that the gods had destined for him. But, in the end, like all those who challenge themselves to the natural order, Sisyphus had paid the price. At first, the gods thought of other forms of punishment. Death, so common in his domain, seemed an easy but too simple exit for someone as bright as Sisyphus. They thought about disappearing at all, erased from existence, but that would be to grant Sisyphus for oblivion, something he did not deserve. Finally, they decided the cruelest, which would leave an indelible mark on their soul and, at the same time, it would keep it present forever, an eternal conviction. It would not be death that would consume it, but life itself, repetitive and empty. Sisyphus had to push the rock. Again and again. The weight of the stone became the weight of his own arrogance, of his deceptions, of his challenge to the gods. Each thrust towards the top represented a vain attempt to free himself, an effort that only brought him closer to the abyss. The sound of the stone when rolling back to the bottom of the mountain resonated in his soul, like an endless echo that twisted in his chest. It was a more painful punishment than any other. It was not the physical wear and tear that hurt him most, but the feeling of being a prisoner of time, of the condemnation of not being able to escape from his own destiny. I couldn't escape the mountain, I couldn't escape the rock. There was nothing more than that. Nothing more than the eternity of that relentless cycle. And then, in the stillness of his conviction, something else began to grow in his heart: despair. The repetition, the endless waiting, the frustration of always being about to achieve something and see how everything collapsed instantly. The blow of the rock falling to the ground, like a broken promise, became a constant hammering in his mind. Every time the rock descended, their dreams, their hope, their own being broke. But there was something in Sisyphus' mind that would never disappear, its resistance. The king of Ephyra was not a man who could be easily bent. If the gods thought his condemnation would break, they were wrong. The rock, so heavy and so monumental, would not be its end. Throughout his conviction, something began to germinate in him, something that even the gods had not planned, the same ingenuity that had led him to make fun of the gods, the same cunning that had maintained a step forward of them. Now he turned against them. Every time he pushed the rock, every time he saw her rolling down, Sisyphus didn't see only failure. I saw an opportunity. Each fall of the rock was a new strategy, a new plan, a new escape attempt. Maybe he could not escape physically, but his mind was still alive, acute, unstoppable. If the mountain did not give him out, if the rock did not release him, at least he could continue to be the master of his own destiny, even for a fleeting moment. And so, in the darkness of his conviction, while the gods watched with satisfaction from their throne, Sisyphus continued to push. With each cycle, with each repetition, he faced the weight of the universe and the despair of the unattainable. But inside, a small spark was still burning, the spark of who knows that, even in the greatest conviction, he is still the owner of his spirit. And that, perhaps, was the only thing that the gods could never take away. His eternal punishment, far from destroying it, transformed it. The rock was no longer just a punishment, it was his challenge. The mountain was no longer its prison, it was his battlefield. And although the cycle would never end, although there would always be a new failed attempt, Sisyphus would continue to push. The condemnation of the gods had not defeated him. The punishment of Sisyphus extends beyond the physical and the immediate. It is a punishment that crosses time, mind, and soul. It is not just the stone that must push or the mountain that will never reach, it is a deep lesson, a reflection of human limits against the divine, pride and cunning that, although powerful, not they can escape the largest forces that govern the cosmos. The gods, when deciding his destiny, not only condemned him to an endless task, but showed him that even the most cunning mind and the bravest heart are insignificant against the immensity of the universe. Sisyphus had lived with the belief that, through his ingenuity and cunning, he could even manipulate the gods. He had cheated Zeus, had mocked death, and had erected himself as a man above his destiny. For him, the ability to deceive was his greatest strength, the one that had led him to govern Ephyra and challenge the author's very authority. But, like all divine lessons, the punishment that the gods imposed came to show him that the arrogance of believing that one can escape the inevitable is a dangerous illusion. The gods had never forgiven their challenge, and Sisyphus had underestimated the power of pride. When trying to make fun of cosmic forces, he believed that his intelligence could rewrite the rules of the world. But the lesson that the gods offered him was clear and cruel: pride, although powerful, cannot change what is predestined. In his attempt to challenge the natural order, Sisyphus had not only faced the gods, but the nature of existence. Eternal punishment, pushing endless rock, is a metaphor for how humans often fight in vain against the natural flow of life, fate, and death. In his conviction, Sisyphus becomes a symbol of those who do not understand the limits of their power. The rock, heavy and immovable, represents the weight of pride, of excessive ambition, which always ends up falling on the same being that tries to lift it. Every time the rock descends towards the abyss, it is a reminder that human efforts, although full of determination and passion, do not always have a lasting impact. Sometimes, no matter how much it fights, the result is the same: the fall, the repetition, the failure. And then, what is the true meaning of the punishment? What lesson do the gods leave us through the eternal Sissy torture? In his conviction, Sisyphus not only pays for his pride, it is also confronted with the fragility of human existence. The punishment, although relentless, is not just a physical punishment. It is a lesson on the value of humility, about the acceptance of human limits, about the understanding that there are much greater forces than us, that we cannot control. The gods, imposing his punishment, taught him that human cunning, however bright, cannot alter the destiny or mock the laws that govern the universe. The lesson, then, is bitter. It teaches us that it doesn't matter how cunning or powerful we believe to be, there will always be something bigger than us, something that pushes us forward, beyond our understanding. Sisyphus, in his punishment, is a reflection of humans fighting against the inevitable, death, fate, the passage of time. As much as they run, no matter how much they strive, there will always be an obstacle that will stop them. The stone will always fall, always. But within the Sisyphus tragedy there is also something that is hidden, a more complex lesson. Although his task seems endless, he continues to push. And that act of continuing, despite everything, reveals a human facet that is more difficult to see with the naked eye: resistance. The lesson is not only about pride, but also about perseverance. Sisyphus is an example of the constant struggle against the impossible, of the determination to move forward, even when the result seems useless. It is a way of highlighting human nature, that ability to find purpose amid suffering, to find strength even in defeat. The meaning of the punishment, then, can be interpreted in different ways. For the gods, it is a warning about excess confidence, a lesson that even the most powerful beings must recognize their limitations. For Sisyphus, it is a constant battle with the reality that it cannot change what is already predetermined. And for us, mortals, the lesson could be a reminder that our fight against superior forces, although often unsuccessful, is not exempt from value. In the end, Sisyphus is not only the man who pushes the rock, but also the man who, despite the defeat, continues to fight. And that is the paradox of his punishment: suffering never ends, but he does not do his resistance either. The lesson is moving forward, even when everything seems lost. Somehow, Sisyphus' punishment also reflects the internal struggle of each human being. The stone, the mountain, the endless cycle, all that is a mirror of our own lives, our own internal battles. Human life is a constant effort to find meaning, to overcome suffering, to achieve a purpose, although he sees we feel that we are condemned to repeat the same mistakes. But Sisyphus' resilience, the way in which the rock continues to be pushed, is a way to show us that the fight, however difficult it is, has its own value. Although destiny is inclement and the effort seems in vain, the will to move forward is what defines our existence. The rock that Sisyphus must push forever is much more than a simple massive stone. In the context of Greek mythology, this rock becomes a complex and deep symbol, loaded with meanings that resonate over time. In its cold and heavy surface, it reflects unavoidable destiny, the human struggle against the absurd, and, in turn, unwavering resistance to adversity. The rock is, above all, a symbol of the weight of the destination. It is a tangible manifestation of what Sisyphus cannot avoid, of what, no matter how much he tries, he always escapes him. In the myth, the rock never reaches the top, which represents the constant attempt of human beings to reach an impossible goal or to overcome a challenge that seems to be beyond their forces. Like life itself, rock is heavy and difficult to move, and, despite all efforts, the end is always the same: the fall, repetition, frustration. In the Greek culture, the rocks were also representations of permanence. The mountains, the stones, and the natural, imposing and almost motionless elements were considered symbols of the eternal, the immutable, which resists the passage of time. In this sense, the rock that Sisyphus pushes becomes a metaphor of human struggles and challenges that, although always present, seem not to change over time. Life is a constant fight against what seems to be bigger than us, something that we cannot change or avoid, something as firm and solid as the rock itself. Throughout its history, the human being has used the rock as a symbol of obstinacy and resistance. In many cultures, the rock represents the solidity of the will, the strength in the face of adversity. It is a symbol of those who, even the impossible, do not give up. But Sisyphus' rock, unlike those heroic representations, has a gloomy meaning. It is not a rock that can be climbed, nor one that offers refuge. It is a rock that falls again and again, which shows us that sometimes our struggles are futile, that no matter how much we try, the result will never be different. This rock does not symbolize victory or the perseverance that leads to success. Instead, it becomes a reminder of the cyclical nature of human suffering. Beyond its literal weight, the rock also symbolizes the burden that drags Sisyphus, the result of its pride, of its challenge to the gods, of its belief that it could change the immutable. At first, the rock is only a stone that represents its punishment, but over time, it becomes an extension of its own essence, its own suffering. Sisyphus' load is not only physical, but also mental. The rock follows it, pursues it, it becomes an inseparable part of its being. Each thrust towards the top reflects not only its effort, but its inability to escape the punishment cycle. It is interesting how the rock, although it looks like a condemnation symbol, also carries a certain dignity. Sisyphus, despite everything, does not give up. Every time the rock falls, pushes it again. He can't leave her behind, he can't get rid of her. And, in this repetitive act, Sisyphus faces the sense of the absurd, the eternal struggle to look for meaning in a world that seems to have it. The rock is a reminder of the irrationality of life, of those moments in which, even though we strive, everything seems to be against us. But also, rock is a symbol of persistent hope. Although the rock falls and the cycle begins again, the action of continuing to push it is an act of resistance. And that resistance, although it does not lead to the final victory, does reveal the strength of the human spirit in the face of the inevitable. The rock is also a symbol of human limits. In spite of all the cunning, the intelligence, and the power that Sisyphus possessed, the rock teaches him that there are things that cannot be overcome. No matter how big the effort is, no matter how brilliant the mind is, some barriers are insurmountable, some challenges are impossible to overcome. The myth reminds us that, no matter how much we want to control our life or mock the rules of the universe, there will always be something bigger than us, something that will impose limits that we cannot transgress. And in these limits, in that constant struggle, there is the true meaning of human life, accepting that defeat is part of the process, that life does not always have a clear purpose, and that suffering is, ultimately, a part of our existence. Thus, the rock is not just a punishment for itself, Sisyphus, but a lesson for all who, like him, seek to change the immutable. The rock represents both the weight of the destination and the endless struggle of those who, despite knowing that they will not win, continue to fight. And although the rock falls again and again, that fall is not just failure, it is also the perpetuation of the act of challenging the impossible. Sisyphus' rock, in its constant descent and ascent, reflects our own human nature, the need to move forward, despite knowing that the end will never be achieved. And it is in that repetition, in that fight without end, where the true symbolism of the rock resides, the eternity of hope and despair intertwined. Sisyphus, even in the depth of his conviction, never gave in to despair. His punishment was eternal, and the mountain seemed to have no end, but inside, something remained intact, his indomitable spirit. He had been defeated by the gods, condemned to a meaningless task, but in each thrust, in each effort to raise the rock to the top, Sisyphus showed a resilience that went beyond the physical, beyond the logical, a fire internal that, no matter how much the mountain crushed it, never went out. At first, his punishment seemed simple. A gigantic stone, and steep slope, and an endless task. What would be more heartbreaking than to see how the fruit of all your effort falls apart again and again? And yet, despite fatigue, despite the certainty of the fall, Sisyphus continued. The repetition of the cycle, the eternal start over, far from breaking it, seemed to strengthen himself. There was no rest, there was no end of the fight, but the fight itself became its reason for being. His rebellion was not against the gods. Somehow, I already knew that this confrontation had lost it. Sisyphus's rebellion was not against fate, or against the punishment that had been imposed. His true act of rebellion was the fact of continuing to fight, of never giving up, even knowing that victory would not come. What meant winning when the task was impossible? In the mountain, in the immensity of his conviction, Sisyphus found a unique sense in resistance itself, in the simple fact of persisting, despite everything. Every time the rock fell, sadness invaded him, yes, but a renewed determination also arose in his chest. No one had given him an exit, nobody had offered a way to escape from the mountain, but Sisyphus, in his heart, had found something much more valuable than an exit, his independence. He could not escape his destiny, he could not change the nature of his suffering, but he could decide how to face it. And he faced him with an arrow of will, with a resistance that defined him as a human being. Sisyphus' useless rebellion was not just an act of challenge. It was a silent cry against the logic of the universe, a demonstration that even when everything seems lost, even when the end is as close as the next decline in the rock, you can still choose to continue. In that useless resistance, in that hopeless struggle of triumph, there was something sublime, something almost divine. The true freedom of Sisyphus was not the release of the rock or the annihilation of punishment. His freedom was in the decision not to give up. In doing so, his spirit rose above the gods and circumstances. Sisyphus was not free because it could escape, it was free because, despite everything, he maintained his intact will. The useless rebellion became a continuous cycle of confrontation with itself. The mountain would never stop being there, the rock will always fall, but its resistance gave Sisyphus a power that could not be taken away. The gods had condemned him to defeat, but defeat himself did not destroy it, on the contrary, he transformed it. In each thrust, Sisyphus told the world, the gods, and to himself that his struggle was not in vain. Through the infinite repetition of his punishment, something in his being raised above the physical, something that even the rock, so heavy and definitive, could crush. It is difficult to understand the magnitude of the Sisyphus rebellion. His punishment was an endless cycle, a war lost from the beginning. But it is precisely in that awareness of the uselessness of its struggle where its true challenge lies, Sisyphus rebelling against the idea that there is nothing beyond suffering, against the notion that life itself does not have a greater purpose than that of the passive acceptance of a cruel destination. Sisyphus, with its constant thrust, refuses to accept that life, even when it is condemned to repetition and suffering, has no value. In your heart, each repetition is a victory over hopelessness. Every time the rock falls, he gets up again. And in that act, more and more unstoppable, it shows us the greatness of the human, the ability to resist, even when there is no victory on the horizon. Sisyphus' rebellion is, in the end, a rebellion against despair. He cannot change his destiny, he cannot alter the sentence of the gods, but what he can do is reject the fatality of total defeat. Each rock thrust is a small act of freedom. Every time the stone falls, it is a reminder that the fight continues, that life does not have to be a passive acceptance of what they impose. The punishment may be eternal, that the rock never reaches the top, but while Sisyphus continues to fight, its rebellion is more powerful than any punishment. His indomitable spirit before the absurdity of his conviction is not only a reflection of his character, but also an echo of our own daily struggle. We all face challenges, many of which seem insurmountable. But true strength, as in the case of Sisyphus, is not to overcome the mountain, but in the resistance itself, to continue pushing the rock, again and again. Sisyphus teaches us that true rebellion is not in the fight for a result, but in the decision to never give up, to move forward even when the end seems unattainable. Thus, Sisyphus' rebellion, however useless it is in its results, becomes an act of affirmation. In his continuous challenge to what seems inevitable, Sisyphus reminds us that freedom is not in victory, but in the ability to resist regardless of what awaits us at the end of the mountain. Sisyphus and Prometheus are two mythical figures whose stories have endured over the centuries, not only for the magnitude of their punishments, but for the deep lessons that embody. At first glance, both characters seem to share the mark of disobedience, the challenge towards the gods, and the consequent condemnation of eternal punishment. However, when looking more closely, a fascinating contrast is revealed between the two, not only in the type of suffering they must endure, but in the attitudes they adopt against their destiny. Prometheus is known for having stolen the fire of the gods to give it to humans, an act of disobedience that represents a sacrifice in the name of humanity. His punishment is severe. Zeus condemns him to be chained to a rock, where an eagle will devour the liver every day, just to regenerate every night, so that the suffering never ends. In the history of Prometheus, his suffering has a clear purpose, it is a sacrifice for men. He, like Sisyphus, faces eternal punishment, but the crucial difference lies in the meaning of his sacrifice. Prometheus not only challenges the gods for pure arrogance or desire for power, he does it for the love of humanity, for the hope that his action will transcend the pain and give a better future to human beings. There is a nobility, an altruism, in the sacrifice of Prometheus that makes it a hero, even in the middle of its torment. His suffering, although eternal, has an ultimate goal, the emancipation of man, the gift of fire, which is the symbol of knowledge, civilization, and progress. Sisyphus, on the other hand, faces a punishment that seems to lack purpose or redemption. His condemnation, pushing the rock towards the top of a mountain just to see it fall again and again, is a punishment without glory or end. There is no benefit to others in their suffering, nor a superior cause that justifies their eternal effort. Sisyphus challenges the gods for pride and cunning, for the belief that he can mock the forces of the universe with his intelligence. In his case, there is no altruistic sacrifice, but a selfishness that drives him to challenge Zeus, the king of the gods, hoping to get his out. His punishment is the reflection of the futility of his attitude. No matter how much he tries to manipulate the circumstances, the only thing he obtains is a meaningless task, an endless repetition. While Prometheus is a symbol of sacrifice, hope, and resistance for a greater good, Sisyphus represents the emptiness of excessive pride and the struggle without purpose. In this sense, their punishments reflect their attitudes towards divine power and fate. Prometheus challenges the gods for the sake of humanity, with the hope that their suffering, although infinite, will have a transcendental value. His punishment is cruel, but is impregnated with a type of heroism and sacrifice that gives meaning beyond suffering itself. Prometheus's story tells us about the limits of divine power, but also of the human capacity to resist and challenge even the gods in the name of a better future. On the other hand, Sisyphus' punishment is characterized by its absurdity and uselessness. The mountain never climbs completely, the rock never reaches the top. Sisyphus's suffering is not directed towards a greater good or a change for the world, his suffering is only yours. There is no redemption in its history, there is no hope of a better future, just an endless repetition of the same futile effort. While that Prometheus challenges the gods for a purpose, Sisyphus does it for pure vanity, without understanding the magnitude of what it faces. Prometheus's struggle is an act of sacrifice for humanity, while Sisyphus's struggle is an effort to deceive divine forces and demonstrate their superiority. However, both characters share a common feature, their ability to resist. Although Sisyphus' punishment is futile and his struggle is endless, his spirit never breaks. Although every time he pushes the rock towards the top, he falls again, he does not give up. Similarly, Prometheus, although it is destroyed every day by the eagle, never breaks. The resistance of both characters, although motivated by very different reasons, becomes its defining characteristic. Both, in their own way, challenge the idea that suffering is a form of defeat. In their respective punishments, they stand as symbols of unwavering struggle against the inevitable. Prometheus, being finally released by Heracles, finds a form of redemption, although late. His suffering has a conclusion, a purpose that has been worth it. Sisyphus, on the other hand, is sentenced to its destiny without hope of liberation. There is no rescue for him, nor a glorious ending on his horizon. While Prometheus, in his sacrifice for humanity, reaches immortality in the collective imagination as a hero who challenged the gods for the love of humanity, Sisyphus becomes a symbol of the absurd struggle, of meaningless resistance to an immovable destination. Both, however, are victories in their own right. Prometheus can be considered a hero for his sacrifice in the name of human progress, while Sisyphus, although condemned to eternal and absurd repetition, remains firm in his challenge, demonstrating that the human spirit, even before the most cruel and insurmountable, it can resist. His punishment, although useless, reflects a form of resistance that, in its purest form, becomes a kind of triumph against impotence. Sisyphus's fight does not have an end, but its resistance to the inevitable is what makes it eternal. Thus, Sisyphus and Prometheus are two sides of the same currency, one, the sacrifice for a greater good, the other, useless resistance to a destination that cannot be challenged. Both, however, teach us about the power of the human spirit against the eternal and unwavering. For the Greeks of antiquity, the myth of Sisyphus was not just a story of divine punishment, it was a deeply symbolic representation of tensions between mortals and the gods, between human cunning and the absolute power of deities. This myth resonated in the heart of a culture that valued ingenuity, but also recognized the limits imposed by the cosmos and divine morality. In classical Greece, Sisyphus was seen as the epitome of cheating and excessive intelligence. The stories of his cunning, from how he managed to make fun of Thanatos to the deception of Persephone in the Underworld, made him a fascinating character. However, that same skill for deception that allowed him to overcome impossible obstacles also led him to his ruin. For the Greeks, this duality in Sisyphus was a warning. Excess confidence in oneself, even when accompanied by talent and ingenuity, can become the seed of the destruction itself. Sisyphus' eternal punishment was interpreted as an expression of divine justice. For a society that believed in the notion of balance and in the intervention of the gods as guardians of the cosmic order, his conviction was a lesson about the importance of respecting the limits. In Greek mythology, disobeying the gods or trying to make fun of them was not only an individual transgression, but an act that threatened to destabilize the delicate balance between the mortal and divine world. The Greeks considered that Sisyphus, challenging Zeus, Asopo, and Hades himself, had tried to alter that balance. His punishment was not arbitrary, it was a restoration of the cosmic order, a reminder that no mortal, however cunning it was, could escape the power of the gods. The myth of Sisyphus also had a philosophical dimension in classical Greece. It represented the concept of effort without reward, something that resonated in the universal human experience. The Greeks, with their focus on the tragedy and complexities of existence, saw in Sisyphus a metaphor of the constant and often useless struggle of the human being against forces that cannot be controlled. In this sense, his punishment was not only an example of divine justice, but a reflection on the human condition. The idea of a man eternally striving to reach an unattainable goal encapsulated the tragic feeling that permeated a large part of Greek literature and thought. Sisyphus' artistic and literary representations in classical Greece varied, but they all shared an approach to the inevitability of their destiny. In the painted vessels, the sculptures, and the reliefs that represented their myth, the figure of Sisyphus pushing the rock was in great detail, highlighting the tension in his body, the sweat on his forehead, the monumentality of the rock. These images transmitted not only physical suffering, but also the unwavering effort of a man trapped in an endless task. The mountain, always present in the representations, symbolized both the immensity of the challenge and the immutability of the destination. In poetry and dramaturgy, Sisyphus was often portrayed as a figure that challenged human limits. Authors such as Pindaro and Homer mentioned their history, underlining both their ingenuity and their punishment. Pindaro, in particular, said Sisyphus, despite its cunning, could not escape divine justice. In Homer's Odyssey, Sisyphus's myth is briefly narrated in the context of souls condemned in Hades, but even in that brief mention, it is clear that his eternal suffering was seen as an exemplary punishment. The playwrights, meanwhile, explored the moral and philosophical implications of their history, using Sisyphus as a vehicle to discuss destiny, free will, and the relationship between mortals and gods. Through these representations, the Greeks transmitted a clear warning: cunning and human intelligence are powerful, but also dangerous gifts if they are not used with respect for superior forces. Sisypho personified hybris, the excess of confidence that led mortals to challenge the gods. His punishment was a reminder of the inevitable consequences of this arrogance. At the same time, the myth had an inspiring component, although tragic. Sisyphus's struggle, although futile, was also an expression of human resilience, of the ability to move forward even when destiny seems immovable. In classical Greece, the myth of Sisyphus was not just a story to be told, it was a tool to reflect on the nature of existence, the limits of human power, and the need to balance ambition with respect for the cosmic order. When exploring the meaning of their punishment, the Greeks not only tried to understand the will of the gods, but also the place of the human being in a vast and enigmatic universe. In the Greek theatre, Sisyphus's myth found a particular resonance in both tragedy and comedy, although from perspectives and radically different tones. The playwrights of the time, such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and Aristophanes, used the figure of Sisyphus to explore fundamental issues about the human condition, the relationship with the gods, and the tensions between cunning and morality. Each, with his unique style, added nuances to the myth that reflected the complexities of Greek culture. In the context of the tragedy, Sisyphus embodied hybris, that excess of confidence and arrogance that leads mortals to challenge the divine order. Although the specific works on Sisyphus of Aeschylus and other playwrights have been lost, the fragments that survive and the references in other works suggest that the tragic one saw it as a deeply symbolic figure. Its history represented the inevitable clash between human intelligence and the superior forces that govern the cosmos. Aeschylus, known for his interest in the destiny and divine justice, would probably have emphasized the inexorable character of Sisyphus's punishment. In their tragic vision of the world, mortals that challenged the gods not only suffered from their transgression, but did it on a cosmic scale, as a reminder for all. In this sense, Sisyphus would align with characters such as Prometheus, whose rebellion against Zeus also condemned him to an eternal torment. However, while Prometheus was presented as a tragic hero whose suffering had an altruistic purpose, Sisyphus was seen as a more ambiguous figure, a man whose cunning, although admirable, lacked a noble cause and ended up being his own perdition. Euripides, known for his psychological approach and his ability to humanize the mythical characters, would have explored Sisyphus's motivations in a deeper way. In Euripides' works, the characters usually face complex moral dilemmas, and it is easy to imagine that in their version of the myth, Sisyphus would have been portrayed not only as a cheater but as a man trapped between his ambition and the restrictions imposed by the gods. Euripides could have used its history to question divine justice, showing how the gods punished mortals for using precisely the cunning and intelligence gifts that they themselves had granted. In comedy, on the other hand, the figure of Sisyphus was transformed into a vehicle for satire and humor, particularly in the works of Aristophanes. In the comic theater, the mythological characters were often mocked, and Sisyphus was no exception. His image as a man eternally condemned to push a rock uselessly offered a rich source of absurd humor. Aristophanes, with his sharp ingenuity and his ability to caricature even the gods, could have represented Sisyphus as a pathetic but hilarious figure, a man whose intelligence became ridiculous in the face of the inevitability of his punishment. The Greek comedy, especially in the hands of Aristophanes, was also a means to criticize the social and political institutions of the time. In this context, Sisyphus could have become a symbol of human struggles against oppressive and immovable systems. His eternal effort to push the rock could have been a metaphor for the useless tasks that citizens faced under unfair laws or incompetent leaders. Aristophanes would have found in the figure of Sisyphus a way to combine social criticism with humor, creating a work that, although comical, invited to reflect on the nature of human efforts. An interesting example of how Sisyphus could be reinterpreted in the Greek theatre is the famous Sisyphus fragment, attributed to Critias, an author of the Sophist school. This text presents a radically different vision of the myth, suggesting that Sisyphus was the creator of the idea of the gods as a way of controlling men through fear. In this version, Sisyphus is not only a cheater, but an early philosopher, someone who understands how to manipulate human beliefs for their own benefit. Although it is not part of the conventional theatre, this approach reflects how the myth could be adapted to discuss philosophical and political issues in classical Greece. Together, Sisyphus' treatment in tragedy and Greek comedy shows the versatility of the myth and its ability to address universal issues. In the tragedy, Sisyphus was a solemn reminder of the limits of human ambition and the relentless justice of the gods. In comedy, he became a comic figure that, despite his ingenuity, could never overcome the absurd uselessness of his punishment. Both approaches, however, shared a common characteristic: the recognition that the history of Sisyphus, with its mixture of cunning, pride and eternal suffering, spoke deeply to human experience. In Roman mythology, Sisyphus's myth was not only inherited from the Greek tradition, but also acquired own nuances that reflected the cultural, religious, and philosophical priorities of Rome. Although the Romans borrowed many figures and stories of the Greeks, their reinterpretations often sought to emphasize values such as the duty, discipline, and role of the individual within the community, central elements in the Roman mentality. In this context, the figure of Sisyphus maintained its symbolic character, but was integrated in ways that spoke directly to the ethos of Rome. For the Romans, the history of Sisyphus retained its tragic and moralizing essence. Her eternal punishment to push a rock on the slope of a mountain just to see her rolling again symbolized not only the uselessness of challenging the gods, but also the futility of certain human efforts. In a deeply oriented society towards civic virtue and responsibility, the Romans could interpret myth as a warning against selfishness and excessive ambition. Sisyphus, a man who used his cunning for his own purposes without consideration in the divine or social order, represented a deviation of the values that the Romans sought to embody. The myth was also philosophically reinterpreted in Rome, especially in the Stoic and Epicurean currents, which influenced the way in which the Romans understood the notions of destiny, effort, and suffering. The Stoics, for example, saw in the punishment of Sisyphus an opportunity to reflect on resistance to inevitable adversities. According to this perspective, although his task was useless, Sisyphus's attitude to his destiny was what really defined his character. Accepting with dignity and perseverance an inevitable burden was seen as a Stoic ideal, a way to find virtue even in the midst of suffering. On the other hand, the Epicureans could interpret the myth as a criticism of the search for insatiable desires. In his philosophy, Sisyphus's endless effort to fulfill an impossible task could symbolize those who pursue pleasures or endless ambitions, trapped in a cycle of perpetual frustration. For Epicureans, the lesson of myth was the need to avoid such behaviors and focus on achieving a state of balance and serenity. In Latin literature, authors such as Ovid, Horacio, and Ino Necker mentioned the myth of Sisyphus in their works, adapting it to their own poetic and philosophical ends. Ovid, in its Metamorphoses, includes references to the punishment of Sisyphus in the Tartar, presenting it as one of the souls convicted in the underworld next to Tantalo and Ixion. Their description focuses on the eternal and exhausting character of punishment, highlighting the inevitability of the destiny that the gods impose on those who challenge them. Horacio, on the other hand, mentions Sisyphus in his odes, using it as a symbol of useless effort and comparing it with the efforts of men looking for wealth or endless power. In these verses, Sisyphus becomes a warning about the traps of excessive ambition and the vanity of worldly achievements. Seneca, an outstanding Stoic philosopher, reflects on the myth of Sisyphus in his philosophical works, using it as an example of how men must face suffering and inevitable adversities with strength and acceptance. In its approach, the history of Sisyphus transcends the scope of divine punishment and becomes a metaphor of life itself, in which each one must find meaning and virtue in the circumstances that are imposed. In addition to literature, the myth of Sisyphus also had some presence in Roman visual arts, although less frequently than in Greek art. Sisyphus representations in mosaics and reliefs, although scarce, often showed it in the act of pushing their rock, capturing the physical effort and tension of their endless task. These images could decorate villas and other private spaces, functioning as visual reminders of the nature of the destination and the moral lessons that the myth implied. The Roman context also allowed the myth of Sisyphus to be used as a rhetorical tool in political speeches and writings. For Roman leaders and speakers, the figure of Sisyphus could be evoked to criticize or satirize those who pursued impossible objectives or acted with arrogance and selfishness. In this sense, myth was not only a moral history, but also a versatile cultural tool to comment on human challenges and failures. Ultimately, the influence of the Sisyphus myth in Rome demonstrates how Greek narratives adapted to Roman sensibilities and priorities. Although the Romans inherited the myth with their original warning message against hybris, they transformed it to reflect their own concerns about the duty, human effort, and the relationship between the individual and the cosmic order. Thus, Sisyphus, with its eternal rock, continued to be a powerful and multifaceted symbol, adapting to the changing needs of the cultures that evoked it. During the Middle Ages, the myth of Sisyphus survived as an echo distant from classical traditions, adapted and reinterpreted to fit into a world dominated by Christianity and its spiritual values. Although Greek and Roman mythology lost prominence against biblical narratives and religious texts, classical stories did not disappear completely. Instead, they were leaked through medieval texts, philosophical comments, and literary works, often transformed to reflect the theocentric worldview of the time. The myth of Sisyphus, with its powerful image of endless effort, resonated especially as a metaphor for divine punishment and the uselessness of human actions outside the framework of spiritual salvation. The Middle Ages saw the world through the lens of Christian morality, and Sisyphus, punished for its pride and deception, became a symbol of condemned souls, trapped in the eternity of suffering due to their sins. One of the main channels through which the myth reached the Middle Ages was the work of Latin authors such as Ovid, Horacio, and Seneca, whose texts remained read and commented on in monasteries and learning centers. Ovid's Metamorphoses, for example, continued to be a rich source of inspiration for medieval writers. The punishment of Sisyphus in the Tartar was mentioned along with the torments of other condemned souls, such as Tantalo and Ixion, reinforcing the idea that transgressions against the divine order led to eternal consequences. The myth also found a place in the encyclopedic and allegorical texts of the time, which sought to synthesize the knowledge of the classical world with Christian theology. In these works, Sisyphus was described as an example of vanity and pride, characteristics that medieval writers considered mortal sins. His rock was reinterpreted as a symbol of sin's weight, which the convicted ones carry eternally because of their inability to repent and seek redemption. For example, in Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy, although Sisyphus does not explicitly appear, its history resonates in the representment of sinners in hell. Dante, influenced by classical tradition and Christian theology, describes eternal torments that remember Sisyphus' punishment, such as greed and prodigal, which push large weights in an endless circle. These punishments, such as Sisyphus, are designed to reflect the very nature of sins that brought each soul to their conviction. In medieval narratives, the myth of Sisyphus was also used as a moral warning against human attempts to challenge God's designs. Religious texts often condemned cunning and deception if they were used for personal benefit, and Sisyphus, known for their ability to deceive even the gods, was a perfect example of what happens when intelligence deviates from the paths of the virtue. Its history aligned with other figures of classical mythology that embodied hybris, as Prometheus, but with a clear Christian reinterpretation that underlined the need for humility and obedience. The myth was also adopted in popular literary traditions and the didactic stories that flourished in the Middle Ages. These stories used to be transmitted orally or collected in manuscripts, and although the figure of Sisyphus was rarely mentioned by its name, its essence survived in stories that warned against the useless effort or the dangers of challenging divine authority. The idea of an eternal punishment for sin was deeply echoed in an obsessed era with the concept of the final judgment and the reward or eternal punishment in the other life. In addition, the symbolism of Sisyphus' rock was incorporated into medieval visual and artistic language. Although the explicit representations of Sisyphus were rare in Christian art, the reason for the weight of sin and the endless struggle was reflected in illustrations of manuscripts, fresh and sculptures that represented those condemned in hell. These images, loaded with moral and spiritual meaning, connected Sisyphus's useless struggle with the fate of souls that failed to free themselves from sin. Finally, the myth of Sisyphus also acquired a philosophical meaning in the medieval texts influenced by the scholastic tradition. Philosophers such as Thomas Aquinas and Boecio, although they did not directly deal with the myth, worked with concepts that related to their message. The idea of human struggle against futility and the search for purpose beyond earthly limitations aligned with Christian thought about divine grace as the only source of true redemption and meaning. In summary, during the Middle Ages, the myth of Sisyphus persisted as a powerful metaphor that was reinterpreted through the lenses of Christian morality and medieval philosophy. Although its original context in Greek mythology vanished, its essence as a symbol of useless effort, eternal punishment, and the consequences of human pride continued to resonate in the texts and images of the time. Thus, Sisyphus, pushing his rock without rest, remained a shady reminder of the limits of ambition and the importance of virtue in a world governed by the divine order. In the Renaissance, an era marked by the resurgence of arts, sciences, and classical ideas, the myth of Sisyphus found a fertile terrain to be reborn and transformed. This period, which looked with admiration for Greco-Roman antiquity, recovered myths, legends, and symbols that had remained in the shadow during the Middle Ages. Among them, Sisyphus' figure once again occupied a prominent place, not only as an example of classical mythology, but also as a metaphor that the thinkers, artists, and writers of the time reinterpreted according to the concerns and values of their time. In the Renaissance, the image of Sisyphus with its rock became a symbol of the human condition, reflecting the tensions between the effort, ambition, and the limitations imposed by destiny. Unlike the Middle Ages, which had focused its attention on the eternal punishment of Sisyphus as a lesson of humility and submission, Renaissance thinkers saw him in a more complex light, often emphasizing his ingenuity, his resistance, and his challenge in front of adversity. This change of perspective reflected the spirit of the Renaissance, which celebrated the individual and his ability to transcend difficulties through reason and creativity. The resurgence of interest in Sisyphus was closely linked to the rediscovery of the literary works of antiquity. Writers such as Ovid, Horacio, and Seneca, whose interpretations of the myth had been preserved by medieval scholars, were read with renewed enthusiasm. Renaissance humanists, fascinated by classical texts, searched for not only moral lessons, but also ideas that could apply to life and contemporary soups. In this context, the myth of Sisyphus was reinterpreted as a representation of human efforts to achieve knowledge and overcome the limits imposed by nature and society. In the visual arts, Sisyphus appeared in paintings, engravings, and sculptures, often represented in the act of pushing its rock, with the face marked by the effort and determination. Artists such as Tiziano and Miguel Angel, although they did not directly address the myth of Sisyphus in their main works, explored similar themes of struggle, ambition, and challenge through their representations of the human body and emotional expression. These images, loaded with energy and dynamism, captured the spirit of the Renaissance and their focus on man's ability to face apparently insurmountable challenges. In the literary field, Renaissance poets and playwrights adapted the myth of Sisyphus to explore issues such as the struggle for power, the search for knowledge, and tensions between free will and destiny. Some writers used it as a metaphor to reflect on the nature of human work and the constant effort to reach goals that, in the end, can be unattainable. These reinterpretations reflected the anxieties and hopes of an era that was redefining his understanding of the place of man in the universe. The myth was also retaken in the philosophical and scientific context of the Renaissance. Figures such as Giordano Bruno and Nicholas Machiavelli, although they did not directly treat the myth of Sisyphus, were interested in ideas that resonated with their symbolism. Bruno, with his vision of the infinite universe and his challenge to the established ideas, and Machiavelli, with his emphasis on cunning and ambition in politics, represented a spirit that could be In this sense, Sisyphus could be interpreted as a symbol of scientists and thinkers who, facing a vast and unknown world, dedicated their lives to push the borders of knowledge, despite the difficulties and uncertainties. In addition, the Renaissance brought with it a new approach to humanism, which placed the human being in the center of creation and celebrated its ability to overcome adversities. In this context, Sisyphus ceased to be seen exclusively as a punished sinner and became a symbol of human resistance and perseverance. His eternal struggle with the rock became an allegory of the human condition, reflecting both achievements and limitations inherent to human experience. In the Renaissance courts, where the artistic and literary patronage flourished, the myth of Sisyphus was also used as a tool to reflect on power and politics. The rulers, facing the complexities of the government and the demands of their subjects, could see in the figure of Sisyphus a representation of their own effort to maintain balance in an unpredictable world. This use of the myth reflected the tension between personal ambition and responsibilities inherent to leadership. In summary, the Renaissance marked a crucial stage in the rediscovery and reinterpretation of the Sisyphus myth. As the classic ideas intertwined with contemporary concerns and values, Sisyphus ceased to be simply a punished sinner and became a complex and multifaceted symbol. In their eternal struggle, Renaissance thinkers and artists found a powerful metaphor to explore the aspirations, limits, and possibilities of the human being in a world that was rediscovering its own greatness. Albert Camus, in his philosophical essay The Myth of Sisyphus, 1942, turned the figure of Sisyphus into an emblem of his philosophy of the absurd, a reflection that deeply resonated in the 20th century, especially in the context of a Europe marked by the two world wars and the existential crisis that they caused. Camus reinterpreted the Greek myth, giving him a completely new meaning that went beyond eternal condemnation and divine punishment to enter the fundamental questions of human existence. What does life have? How can we live in an indifferent and transcendent purpose? Camus' part of an essential statement, life is absurd. Not because it lacks beauty or emotion, but because the human being constantly seeks a meaning in a world that does not offer answers. The tension between this incessant search, the meaning and silence of the universe, is what Camus defines as the absurd. For him, Sisyphos' myth perfectly embodies this condition. Sisyphus is condemned to push a rock to the top of a mountain, just to see it rolling again to the bottom, again and again, for all eternity. This useless and endless effort is, for Camus, a metaphor for human existence. The crucial point of Camus' interpretation is not Sisyphus's suffering, but his attitude towards punishment. At the time Sisyphus descends down the hillside to recover the rock, Camus introduces a revolutionary idea: consciousness. It is at that moment of pause, in which Sisyphus is fully aware of the uselessness of his task, where his true greatness resides. It is not about escaping from the absurd or looking for an illusory comfort, but about accepting it and living in the middle of it with dignity and courage. Camus rejects any type of resignation or evasion against absurd. Neither religion, with its promise of a transcendent sense, nor nihilism, with its total denial of the value of life, are satisfactory answers. Instead, he proposes a kind of rebellion, accepting the lack of meaning as an inherent condition of existence and, nevertheless, to continue living fully, find joy in the act of existing. For Camus, Sisyphus is not a symbol of defeat, but of victory. In his own words, you have to imagine Sisyphus happy. Sisyphus's happiness does not come from a divine consolation or a future reward, but from its ability to embrace its destiny and find meaning in its own struggle. Camus invites us to see Sisyphus as an existential hero, someone who, although trapped in an eternal cycle of useless effort, manages to transcend his punishment by not surrendering before him. The rock that pushes is not only a punishment, but also proof of its freedom. Every time Sisyphus puts his hands on the rock, he reaffirms his willingness to continue, to resist. In this context, Camus redefines heroism. It is not the victory in the traditional sense, but the resistance to the inevitable, the commitment to live fully despite the lack of purpose. This type of heroism resonates especially at a time like Camus, marked by disappointment and loss of faith in totalizing ideologies that promise definitive solutions. Sisyphus's struggle reflects people's effort to build their own lives and find meaning in a world that does not offer it inherently. Another important aspect of Camus' analysis is how the myth of Sisyphus dialogues with the modern condition. In a world where religious and philosophical certainties have been questioned, where science and technology fail to answer the fundamental questions of existence, the figure of Sisyphus becomes a universal metaphor. Their endless efforts reflect the routines and daily struggles of people, from the simplest tasks to the highest aspirations. However, Camus insists that even in those apparently useless struggles, there is beauty and value. Camus' reinterpretation also has ethical and political implications. His rejection of nihilism and his emphasis on rebellion as a form of human affirmation connected with a commitment to life and others. The acceptance of the absurd does not imply indifference or isolation, but an invitation to live with intensity, to build provisional meanings through our actions and relationships. In this sense, the Sisyphus figure transcends the personal and becomes a collective symbol, a reminder of the human capacity to resist and create in the midst of adversity. In literary terms, Camus manages to transform myth into a deeply poetic and philosophical work. His language, although loaded with abstract ideas, is deeply evocative and full of images that capture the essence of myth. He describes with a mastery the effort of Sisyphus, the texture of the rock, the arid landscape, the silence of heaven. These details not only enrich their analysis, but also invite the reader to imagine and feel the fight of Sisyphus as their own, as a reflection of their own existence. Ultimately, the myth of Sisyphus of Camus does not offer a solution to the absurd, but a way of facing it. It is not about solving the enigma of life, but about living it fully, of finding joy in the act of pushing the rock, again and again. Camus, through Sisyphus, leaves us with a deeply human paradox, the ability to find freedom in the acceptance of our limitations, to discover meaning in the act of living, even when the universe remains silent. Life like a rock, heavy and unwavering, is a metaphor that encapsulates the essence of human effort and the incessant search for meaning in an indifferent universe. Every day, we get up with a carga in tow, responsibilities, dreams, frustrations, fears. Like Sisyphus, we push our own rock towards a top that never seems definitive. And yet, despite the absurdity of this struggle, we move on, clinging to something bigger, something that perhaps we can never completely define. Human effort has a paradoxical character. On the one hand, we live in a world that does not offer universal responses, where material or spiritual achievements seem transitory to the immensity of time. On the other hand, we find in that same effort a source of meaning and purpose. Sisyphus' rock is not just a punishment, it is also his life, his struggle, his destiny. By accepting that rock, by pushing it every day, it reaffirms its existence. The weight of the rock, far from being just a symbol of suffering, is also a representation of our ability to resist. Every challenge we face, every obstacle we overcome, defines us. The rock is the subject of which our life is made, relationships, works, projects. And although it may seem that the effort is useless, that we will never reach a permanent top, in that act of pushing our humanity lies. It is in the fight, not in the goal, where the meaning is found. Is life, then, a vain effort? That is one of the oldest questions that philosophy has tried to answer. From the Stoics to the existentialists, the thinkers have reflected on how to face the inevitable finitude of existence. For the Stoics, the key was in acceptance, recognize what we cannot change and find serenity in our response to it. For existentialists, such as Albert Camus, the answer was not resignation, but rebellion, living with intensity and authenticity, even when the universe does not give us answers. The rock also symbolizes our aspirations. Each person loads with dreams, goals, and desires that, in many cases, seem unattainable. We want to build a better life, leave a legacy, find love or understanding. However, the effort to achieve these things is often what gives them value. Happiness is not always in reaching the top, but on the path traveled, in the learning we get when pushing the rock a little higher every day. The fight against monotony is also part of this metaphor. The question of the sense of life, often considered abstract, becomes tangible when we think of the rock. If life does not have a universal purpose, then we must create our own meaning. The rock becomes a canvas on which we paint our existence. Each choice, every sacrifice, every moment of joy or sadness, adds something to that unfinished work. Human effort also connects us with others. Although each person's rock is unique, our struggles make us part of a shared experience. We find comfort and strength to share our stories, by helping others with their own loads, understanding that we are not alone in this endless hill. It is in the connection with others where we often find the most significant moments of our lives. The rock metaphor also invites us to reflect on our relationship with time. Pushing the rock is a present act, an action that anchors us in the now. Often, we become obsessed with the future or cling to the past, but the daily struggle with the rock reminds us that life occurs at the present time. It is in that act of pushing, to feel the weight, to advance a little more, where we really live. Finally, the rock confronts us with our own mortality. We know that we will not be here forever, that our lives are finite. However, far from being a reason to despair, this knowledge can be a source of liberation. Like Sisyphus, we can accept our condition and find joy in the effort itself. The inevitability of death does not decrease the value of life, on the contrary, intensifies. Life like a rock teaches us that it is not necessary to find an ultimate meaning to live with purpose. The act of pushing, of resisting, of creating, is in itself an act of affirmation. Our rock does not define us as a burden, but as an opportunity to grow, to transform the effort into something that transcends monotony and absurd. In the pushing act, at every moment of struggle, we discover what it means to be human. The myth of Sisyphus represents one of the most powerful images of human heroism, a heroism that is not found in victory, in success, or in recognition, but in the constant struggle against the absurd. The figure of Sisyphus pushing its rock, knowing that it will always fall again, embodies a resistance that transcends the logic of utility and enters a deeply human territory, the ability to find dignity and meaning in the act of resist. Sisyphus' heroism does not reside in its triumph, because there is no possible triumph. His conviction is eternal, his effort will never be rewarded. However, it does not give up. Every time the rock rolls towards the bottom of the mountain, Sisyphus low behind it, not with resignation, but with an acceptance that is almost challenging. It is in this gesture where we find its greatness. He is not defined by the result of his effort, but by his ability to get up again and again, to face his destiny without giving in. In everyday life, we all face our own version of Sisyphus rock. It can be an exhausting job that seems to have an end, a difficult relationship, a disease, or even the simple act of getting up every day in a world that often seems indifferent to our struggles. Facing these difficulties without falling into despair or apathy is an act of heroism. Not because there is a reward at the end of the road, but because choosing to resist is an affirmation of our humanity. The heroism of the useless forces us to rethink our ideas about success and failure. We live in a society that often measures the value of people for what they achieve, for the results they produce. But Sisyphus teaches us that the value is not at the end of the road, but on the road itself. His struggle, although apparently meaningless, has its own beauty, an ability that arises precisely from its uselessness. It is a reminder that we do not need to justify ourselves to anyone, that our existence has value simply because we choose to move on. Resistance to the absurd is not an act of denial, but of affirmation. Sisyphus does not reject its destiny, hugs it. Instead of surrendering to the futility of his task, he turns his struggle into a declaration of freedom. By accepting his conviction, but continuing to push the rock, Sisyphus takes control of his destiny. Although the gods have condemned him, they cannot take away their ability to decide how they will face their situation. This is your most powerful act, to find meaning where there is no, claiming its autonomy even in the most extreme of circumstances. This idea is deeply resonated in the philosophy of Albert Camus' Absurd. For Camus, human life is inherently absurd because we seek a meaning in a universe that does not offer it. But instead of falling into nihilism, Camus proposes a response of rebellion: accept the absurd and live fully despite him. Sisyphus, in this context, is not a tragic figure, but a hero. His struggle is an act of creation, a way of telling the universe that, even if it makes no sense, he will choose to live with passion and purpose. The heroism of the useless also connects us with something deeply spiritual. In many traditions, the search for meaning amid uncertainty and suffering is seen as a form of transcendence. It is not about finding definitive responses, but about embracing the paradox of finding beauty in the act of persisting. In this sense, Sisyphus is not as far from figures as Job in the Judeo-Christian tradition or the Bodhisattvas of Buddhism, who choose to remain in the cycle of suffering for the good of others. Although the perspectives are different, they all celebrate the human capacity to face the impossible with courage. In addition, Sisyphus' heroism invites us to reflect on the importance of the present. Each rock thrust is a unique moment, an instant in which all its attention is focused on the task. There is no promised future, there is no past to recover, only now. This lesson is especially relevant in a world where we often live trapped in anxiety for what will come or nostalgia for what it was. Sisyphus reminds us that, although the future is uncertain and the immutable past, the present is always within our reach. Finally, this type of heroism has a deep impact on our relationship with others. By recognizing that we all face our own rocks, that we all fight with our loads, develop empathy and solidarity. Sisyphus's effort is not just an individual struggle, it is a reflection of the collective struggle of humanity. By mutually helping our rocks, sharing our resistance stories, we find a sense of community that transcends the absurd. The heroism of the useless is not easy. It requires courage, acceptance, and a willingness to look at the vacuum without blinking. But he is also deeply liberating. It gives us permission to live without the bonds of external expectations, to find joy in the act of existing, to claim our freedom in every step we take, even when it seems that there is no final destination. As Sisyphus, we can be heroes not because of what we achieve, but for how we face the task of living. Sisyphus, with its eternal rock and its perpetual destiny, has become a powerful symbol of humanity itself. In the image of this man condemned to push a rock for all eternity, we find a universal representation of the daily struggle, of the efforts that seem to have no end, and of the tireless search for purpose in a world that often seems indifferent. This myth, reinterpreted over time, deeply resonates in the modern condition, where the balance between effort and meaning is a constant issue. Sisyphus's struggle is not just his, it is everyone's struggle. In our daily lives, we face repetitive tasks, goals that seem to avoid, and social expectations that many times feel heavy loads. The work, family responsibilities, personal aspirations, is all part of a rock that we push day after day. And, as in the case of Sisyphus, the rock does not have a definitive purpose, he always returns, there is always something else to do, another top to achieve. However, myth not only reflects human effort, but also our ability to resist. In Sisyphus, we see the essence of humanity, a species that, despite adversities, continues. Throughout history, we have faced wars, diseases, injustices, and tragedies. And although many of these struggles do not have permanent solutions, we continue trying. The simple act of pushing the rock, of getting up every day to try once again, is a statement of our resilience and our refusal to give us. The modern interpretations of the Sisyphus myth have found in it a metaphor of existence in the contemporary world. In an environment marked by technology, consumerism, and constant demands of productivity, many people feel trapped in monotony and effort cycles. The rock can take the form of a work that does not satisfy, of goals imposed from the outside, or even of a sensation of existential vacuum. However, there is also a beauty in this cycle, an opportunity to find meaning in the effort itself. Albert Camus, one of the modern thinkers who most explored the myth, saw it as a metaphor of the absurd, the search for meaning in a universe that does not offer it. But instead of falling into nihilism, Camus proposes that we must imagine Sisyphus happy. In his interpretation, the act of accepting the uselessness of his task is an act of rebellion and freedom. By deciding to continue pushing the rock, Sisyphus becomes the owner of his destiny. You cannot change your situation, but you can change how you face it. this idea of active acceptance has a deep relevance for humanity. Sisyphus' rock can be the weight of trauma, fear or loss, but its persistence symbolizes the human ability to move forward, even in the darkest moments. In politics and society, Sisyphus represents collective struggles for justice and equality. The social movements, which often face setbacks and constant challenges, are a way of pushing the rock towards a top that seems unattainable. However, the act of fighting for a better world, even when progress is slow or uncertain, is an affirmation of our hope and our belief in change. The myth also finds echo in art and literature, where Sisyphus becomes a symbol of the creativity and human expression. Artists, writers, and musicians often face their own rock, the struggle to create something significant, to overcome internal or external blockages, and to find a voice in a world full of noise. However, as Sisyphus, they also find in their effort a way of transcending, to leave a brand, even if it is ephemeral. The Sisyphus symbol also invites us to reflect on our relationship with time. In a world obsessed with the results and achievements, the rock reminds us that life is not just a series of goals achieved. It is the process, the path traveled, what really defines our experience. Each thrust, every small advance, has an intrinsic value, regardless of whether or not we reach the top. Finally, Sisyphus is a mirror in which we can see both our struggles and our strengths. His myth is not just a warning about pride or challenge to the gods, as could be interpreted in a classic context. It is also a celebration of our humanity, of our ability to find meaning in effort, to resist in the face of the absurd, and to affirm our existence in a world that often seems to lack logic or purpose. In Sisyphus, we find not only a punishment, but a lesson. The fight itself, for repetitive or useless that it seems, is what defines us as human beings. And as long as we continue to push our rocks, as we continue to face our slopes, we will affirm with each step our freedom, our dignity, and our inexhaustible hope. The myth of Sisyphus, with its endless cycle of effort and failure, finds a deep resonance in Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy, especially in its concept of the eternal return. This thought, central in Nietzsche's work, raises a radical and disturbing idea. What would happen if your life, as you live it now, had to repeat infinitely, without changes, in an eternal cycle? Each joy, every suffering, every decision, and every error would be presented again, exactly in the same way, again and again. For many, this idea is overwhelming, an almost unbearable conviction. But for Nietzsche, accepting the eternal return is the maximum statement of life. That is to say yes not only to what is pleasant or easy, but also to the difficult, the painful, and the apparently absurd. And in this philosophical challenge, Sisyphus rises as a perfect symbol, a man who lives in an eternal cycle, pushing his rock again and again, without hope of liberation, but with the possibility of affirming its existence even within that infinite repetition. The connection between Sisyphus and the eternal return lies in the acceptance of the cycle. The rock always falls. The effort always begins again. There is no escape or a transcendental purpose that makes sense of your task. But what would happen if Sisyphus found meaning not at the top that never reaches, but in the act of pushing the rock? What if, instead of resisting his destiny, he hugged him with a force such that even eternity seemed insufficient to contain his will? Nietzsche invites us to consider this possibility, to imagine that the eternal return is not a conviction, but an opportunity to transform our relationship with life. Accepting the eternal return means, in essence, living in a way that we can want to repeat infinitely. It is a challenge to our daily existence, a call to examine our choices and to face our own rocks. For Nietzsche, this acceptance is not resignation, it is an act of power, a triumph over nihilism and despair. And Sisyphus, in his eternal struggle, could be seen as a model of this triumph, provided he manages to affirm his life even in the relentless repetition. This statement is not easy. In life, as in myth, cycles can be exhausting. The routine, the recurring failures, the difficulties that seem to have no end, all this resembles the Sisyphus rock. But the eternal return challenges us to look at these cycles from another perspective. Instead of seeing them as a punishment, we could see them as an invitation to live fully at the present time, to find value in the effort itself, regardless of the results. Like Sisyphus, we can learn to load with our rock not with despair, but with pride. Nietzsche also points out that, In the eternal return, there is no utopian future to achieve an idealized past to return. There is only the present, repeated again and again. This connects deeply with the myth of Sisyphus, where each thrust of the rock is a unique act, an affirmation of the existence in its purest state. For Nietzsche, living as if every moment had to repeat itself forever forces us to face the essentials of our existence, to assume the total responsibility of our lives. In this sense, Sisyphus can be seen as a precursor to the figure of the Übermensch, Superman of Nietzsche, an individual who transcends the traditional categories of meaning and finds in itself the force to affirm life as it is, without the need for external consolation nor of metaphysical justifications. The Superman does not seek to escape the cycle, but to transform it from within, filling it with its own will to power and creation. However, the connection between Sisyphus and the eternal return is not exempt from paradoxes. In the myth, the repetition is imposed by the gods, it is a punishment. In Nietzsche's philosophy, the eternal return is an idea that we must embrace freely, as an act of self-affirmation. This difference highlights the power of perspective. What for the gods is a condemnation can become, for Sisyphus, in an opportunity to claim its existence. In the same way, we, as humans, can transform our own daily struggles into acts of creation and resistance, if we are able to change our relationship with them. The eternal return also leads us to reflect on the importance of the meaning we give to our actions. If everything we do must be repeated forever, then every choice, however small, acquires an infinite weight. This forces us to live with an intensity and authenticity that we rarely allow ourselves in everyday life. And here, again, Sisyphus becomes a teacher. Although his task lacks an obvious purpose, he continues to push the rock. His effort is a reminder that we do not always need an external reason to act. Sometimes, the simple act of doing something with our whole being is enough. Ultimately, the relationship between Sisyphus and the eternal return invites us to rethink our relationship with time, effort, and meaning. It challenges us to see life not as a problem that needs a solution, but as an experience that deserves to be fully lived, even in its repetition. And in this challenge, we find not only the essence of the myth of Sisyphus, but also one of the most powerful lessons of Nietzsche's philosophy, the affirmation of life, as it is, with all its rocks and all its peaks. The myth of Sisyphus, with its eternal condemnation of pushing a rock that never reaches the top, has crossed the centuries, influencing not only in philosophy, but also in modern literature. In a world that often feels empty of meaning, the figure of Sisyphus becomes a symbol of human struggle against absurd repetition of life, the constant search for purpose and resistance to the nonsense. Contemporary writers, aware of the growing alienation and the crisis of meaning of modern society, have reinterpreted the myth to explore issues such as frustration, alienation, repetition, and personal resistance to adversity. One of the first to bring the myth of Sisyphus to the modern context was Albert Camus in his essay The Myth of Sisyphus, 1942. Although this work is not strictly literary, its deep philosophical analysis of the figure of Sisyphus has been an enduring influence on the literature of the 20th century. Camus uses myth as a metaphor of the absurdity, that feeling of mismatch between the human aspirations of finding meaning and the indifferent universe that does not offer answers. For Camus, human life is like Sisyphus' rock, a constant effort, without a final reward, but also an affirmation of our freedom. This concept becomes a central theme in contemporary literature, where characters often face the fight against a world that seems to lack logic or purpose. In the novel La Nausea, 1938, by Jean-Paul Sartre, another of the great existentialist philosophers of the 20th century, we find a clear echo of the myth of Sisyphus. The protagonist, Antoine Roquentin, experiences a feeling of confusion and repulsion to the banality and lack of sense of everyday life. As Sisyphus, Roquentin faces an empty existence of meaning, but unlike Sisyphus, he has not yet found the strength to accept that lack of sense in a productive sense. Roquentin's struggle is internal, facing the idea that life is full of empty and repetitive moments, and his inability to find something beyond the superficiality of existence causes him anguish. However, his experience reflects the human struggle to find something beyond the absurd, a search that in many cases does not have a clear ending. In the trilogy of the Galaxy War of George Lucas, the figure of Sisyphus is found in many of the characters that, despite knowing that their fight is constant and, in many cases, without end, they continue. Luke Skywalker, for example, faces eternal struggle against evil, knowing that the conflict never will be completely resolved, which can be seen as a modern reinterpretation of the myth. The war, chaos, and fighting cycle in the galaxy reflects the painful endless effort that Sisyphus experiences. Although it is not explicitly mentioned, the myth underlies the struggles of the characters, which continue to face similar situations over and over again, without a definitive end. Postmodern literature has also borrowed the myth of Sisyphus to explore the nonsense of traditional narrative structures. Authors such as Italo Calvino in his work If a Traveler, 1979, or Kurt Vonnegut with his famous Slaughterhouse-Five, 1969, have used the repetition and circularity of time as a way to involve the reader in an experience similar to Sisyphus. These authors play with the narrative structure and time to show how human actions may seem cyclical and endless. In Matadero 5, for example, the protagonist, Billy Pilgrim, is disagreeing of time and is condemned to revive his life in random jumps, in the same way that Sisyphus is caught in the constant repetition of his task without being able to escape. In The Tunnel, 1948, of Ernesto Sabato, we find a character, Juan Pablo, who lives caught in his own perception of the world. Although it does not pushing a rock as a Sisyphus, its obsession with a woman and her internal struggle represent a similar cycle, a search that never comes to an end, a repetition of thoughts and acts that lead him to despair and self-destruction. The tunnel is a symbol of this mental confinement, a limited and repetitive space that reflects the experience of Sisyphus, who, despite being aware of its futility, continues, because it has no choice. The concept of the endless fight and the effort without reward also appears in the work of Haruki Murakami, especially in Kafka on the Shore, 2002. The protagonist, Kafka, faces a series of apparently absurd events and, like Sisyphus, fight to understand his destiny and the forces that control him. The repetition and inevitability of destiny in Murakami are reminiscences of Sisyphus's condemnation, but also the personal search of the protagonist to find his own meaning, for fighting an apparently marked destiny, is a tribute to the myth. Life looks like an immovable rock, but still, the characters persist in their effort to climb it. Along the same lines, the American novelist David Foster Wallace in The Infinite Joke, 1996, creates a universe in which his characters are trapped in an endless cycle of consumption, pleasure, addiction, and failure. The characters, like Sisyphus, constantly seek satisfaction or liberation, only to realize that their efforts will never free them. The sense of being trapped in an endless cycle is palpable throughout the work, a scathing satire of modern culture that, like the myth of Sisyphus, challenges the idea that a satisfactory conclusion can ever be achieved. On the Road, 2006, by Cormac McCarthy, the protagonists, a father and his son, fight to survive in a devastated and apparently hopeless world. The repetition of the effort to find food, refuge, and security in a post-apocalyptic world reflects the infinite cycle of the Sisyphus struggle. History does not have a happy ending, the characters continue because they have no choice. However, in their persistence, in their resistance to the inevitable, they find a kind of heroism, an affirmation of their humanity that does not need justification beyond its own existence. In all these stories, the myth of Sisyphus remains a powerful metaphor of human life, especially in contemporary contexts. It reminds us that, although our struggles may seem meaningless, true force lies in the ability to move forward, to find meaning in the effort itself, even when the future seems uncertain and the peak unattainable. Thus, modern writers, either through the philosophy of absurd our unwavering ability to resist. Throughout art history, Sisyphus's myth has been a constant source of inspiration, offering artists a powerful visual metaphor to explore effort issues, condemnation, and the fight against the absurd. The figure of Sisyphus, condemned to push a rock uphill for eternity, has been represented in many ways, each reflecting the concerns of the different eras and artistic movements. Through these representations, artists have managed to capture the universality of myth, transmitting emotions such as despair, resignation, the esperanza, and resistance. One of Sisyphus's first representations in classical art is found in Greek ceramics. Although Sisyphus images are not as common as those of other mythological heroes such as Hercules or Perseus, some vessels of the Hellenistic period show myth scenes. These representations were simple, often based on the iconography of other myths, but they already showed the figure of Sisyphus as a man sentenced to an endless task, an image that would be recorded in the collective memory of Western culture. In the Renaissance, Sisyphus's myth was revised by artists such as Peter Paul Rubens, who approached him in one of his large-format works in 1618, entitled Sisyphus. In this painting, Rubens captures the physical fight of Sisyphus while pushing the huge rock. The representation of the human body in motion, so characteristic of Rubens, emphasizes the tension and effort of the character. Through Sisyphus's musculature, the artist not only conveys the hardness of his conviction, but also human strength, resistance, and fight against the inevitable. However, in the Rubens scene, there are no signs of defeat. Rather, Sisyphus presents itself as a physical hero, a figure that, although trapped in its destination, continues to fight with courage. The myth also appears in the work of the painter Giorgio de Chirico, a key artist of the Surrealist movement. In his painting The Return of Ulysses, 1918, by Chirico uses the figure of Sisyphus to capture the concept of time and repetition in a work that transmits a sensation of alienation and mystery. In the painting, the figure of Sisyphus is surrounded by empty and desolate landscapes, and its struggle seems even more lonely and absurd, a central theme in surreal works. Sisyphus' rock is not only a physical object, but also a symbol of psychological and existential obstacles that stalk humanity. The Spanish artist Francisco de Goya, in his series of engravings The Disasters of War, 1810 to 1820, presents images that evoke despair, human suffering, and the constant struggle against a cruel destiny, although it does not address the myth of Sisyphus directly. However, his works, with his deep emotional burden and his representation of hopeless human suffering, seem to resonate with the essence of myth. The repetition of violence and suffering in Goya's images reflects the eternal repetition that characterizes Sisyphus's condemnation. In the 20th century, the myth of Sisyphus becomes an important source of inspiration for artists of the expressionist and abstract movement. One of the most shocking examples of the representation of the Sisyphus myth in modern art is the sculpture Sisyphus, 1943, by Alberto Giacometti. In this sculpture, Giacometti presents an extremely thin, almost disintegrated human figure, fighting a rock. The fragility of the figure of Sisyphus, together with the gigantic rock, symbolizes the contrast between vulnerable humanity and the implacability of destiny. The sculpture reflects the struggle of modern man, caught between his physical limitations and his desire for transcendence, facing a task that never ends. Giacometti, known for his elongated and dehumanized figures, uses the space and way to convey alienation and hopeless effort of the characters. The French painter Marcel Duchamp also takes the myth of Sisyphus as a reference in his work, particularly in his famous series of the Sisyphus Waterfall, 1945, which shows a metaphorical image of the same act of pushing the rock. Although Duchamp did not make a direct representation of the myth, his interpretation focuses on the absurd and the repetitive characteristics inherent to the myth. Duchamp, a central figure of the Dadaist movement, uses the concept of useless and meaningless effort as a comment on the irrationality of modern life and society. The work becomes a criticism of the system, such as Sisyphus's struggle is against the gods, but with the freedom offered by the renunciation of traditional structures. In the field of contemporary sculpture, the Greek artist Kostas Vorotsos presents a modern vision of the myth in his famous Sisyphus sculpture, 1983, located in the National Museum of Contemporary Art in Athens. In this sculpture, Vorotsos used glass and steel to represent a human figure that seems to be trapped in a cycle of movement, fighting to advance with a rock that cannot move. The transparency of glass and the hardness of steel create a contrast that symbolizes the tension between human fragility and the resistance of the outside world. In the world of photography, Sisyphus's myth has also been explored by artists such as Sally Mann, who in his series Immediate Family, 1992, presents images that evoke human struggle in a world full of chaos and difficulties. Although not directly linked to the figure of Sisyphus, his photograph transmits the same feeling of exhaustion and perpetual effort, similar to Sisyphus when pushing his rock. Mann's images capture the daily struggle of human beings, particularly in family contexts, and transmit the feeling of being trapped in a cycle that never seems to stop. The myth of Sisyphus is also reflected in cinematographic works. Directors such as Orson Welles, in their movie The Process, 1962, have brought the concept of Sisyphus to the big screen. The protagonist's struggle to understand and escape from an oppressive and absurd judicial system resembles Sisyphus's task. The frustration and impotence of the characters in the face of a system that does not offer answers, together with the inevitability of their destiny, echo the myth of Sisyphus, who also faces a punishment without solution. Repetition, constant struggle, and lack of progress are recurring issues in contemporary cinema, reflecting the universality of myth. Through the centuries, Sisyphus' visual representations have evolved, but the essence of myth remains the same: the eternal struggle against an immutable destiny. Whether in classical art, rebirth, surrealism, or contemporary art, Sisyphus has served as a powerful metaphor of human struggle against absurdity and inevitability. Each representation not only shows the suffering of Sisyphus, but also a deep statement of human life in its constant struggle to find meaning and purpose, even when everything seems lost. The myth of Sisyphus has transcended the borders of classical mythology, reaching various forms of artistic and cultural expression, including cinema and television. This powerful story of a man condemned to perform an endless and hopeless task, fighting a destiny that seems immutable, has captivated filmmakers and screenwriters, who have reinterpreted the myth on numerous occasions to address issues such as absurd, the constant fight, and the resistance to the inevitable. In popular culture, Sisyphus becomes a symbol of the human condition, the struggle to find meaning in a world that often seems to be out of our control. One of the first and most obvious influences of the myth of Sisyphus in the cinema is found in the film of Louis Buñuel, The Exterminating Angel, 1962, a surreal work that could be considered a modern rereading of the myth. In this film, a group of people is caught in a house without being able to leave, an absurd state and without explanation. The discomfort of the characters, who try to escape but cannot, reflects the feeling of being sentenced to an endless repetition, similar to Sisyphus's destination. Although the mythological hero, the structure of the film, the stagnation of the characters and their useless struggle to find an exit, echo the condemnation of the Sisyphus myth, challenging the notions of freedom and destiny are not explicitly mentioned. In Andrei Tarkovsky's work, a director known for his philosophical cinema approach, Sisyphus's myth clearly resonates in his films, particularly in Stalker, 1979. The film presents three characters that embark on a journey to a mysterious area called the Zone, which is able to fulfill the deepest wishes of those who venture into it. However, what begins as a hope of finding answers and realization quickly becomes a constant and incessant struggle, where effort seems useless. The film explores the idea of an unrealizable desire and the effort without reward, a topic that is also present in the myth of Sisyphus. The protagonist of Stalker, like Sisyphus, is caught in a search cycle that never ends, challenging the expectations and notion that the goals achieved will bring lasting satisfaction. In the Hollywood cinema, there is an explicit reference to the myth of Sisyphus in the movie Groundhog Day, 1993, directed by Harold Ramis and starring Bill Murray. This comedy focuses on Phil Connors, a selfish man who is caught in a temporary loop, reviving the same day again and again without being able to escape from him. At first, Phil tries to take advantage of the situation to satisfy his personal desires, but soon realizes that infinite repetition does not bring you satisfaction, only despair. As Sisyphus, Phil is condemned to a repetitive task, but unlike the original myth, his trip leads him to a personal transformation, in which he learns to find meaning and purpose in repetition. The film uses the concept of endless repetition and the fight against time to represent the AB currency of human life, similar to the condemnation of Sisyphus. Sisyphus's myth has also been adapted in science fiction cinema, especially in The Matrix, 1999, directed by the Wachowski sisters. The film explores philosophical issues related to reality, freedom, and destiny, which are aligned with Sisyphus' narrative. The main characters, particularly Neo, are trapped in a cycle of fighting machines, where their efforts seem incessant and even useless at certain times. Although there is no direct reference to Sisyphus, the concept of being trapped in a system that seems immune to any attempt to change or resistance is essential both in The Matrix and in myth. Neo, like Sisyphus, looks for a way to break the cycle, but to do so, you must learn to understand and accept its place within a much greater system. Another clear example of Sisyphus' influence on television is the Lost series, 2004 to 2010. In this series, the characters are trapped on a mysterious island, facing repetitive and no-solution situations. Like Sisyphus, many of the Lost characters seem to be condemned to face endless evidence without hope of liberation. Throughout the series, the protagonists struggle to find answers, but are constantly facing new obstacles that seem to have no end. The connection with the myth of Sisyphus is evident in how the characters, despite despair, continue forward, driven by the need to find meaning in a world that does not offer clear answers. In the Simpsons series, Sisyphus's myth also has its place. In the episode entitled Homer the Heretic, 1992, Homer Simpson faces a dilemma that resonates with the idea of useless effort. During the episode, Homer decides not to attend the church, but ends up discovering that his life, although less structured, remains a constant search for balance between work and fun. Although Sisyphus is not explicitly mentioned, Homer's struggle to find a purpose in his life reflects the constant human search by meaning in the middle of the daily routine. Homer's ability to resist, despite frustrations, is close to the very nature of the myth, in which the hero continues to push the rock, regardless of the obstacle. Christopher Nolan's cinema, especially with his work Inception, 2010, also has an interpretation of the Sisyphus myth in his treatment of time and dreams. In the film, the characters struggle to change the perceptions of reality through dreams, but their efforts seem to be trapped in a cycle that never ends. Although the protagonist, Dom Cobb, seeks a way to release his mind from the burden of the past, constantly faces new difficulties, a reflection of Sisyphus's conviction. The film questions the ability to escape a repetition cycle and shows that, even when the characters reach their goals, they can still feel trapped. In the Twilight Zone series, the myth of Sisyphus is also found in several episodes, particularly those who deal with the cycle of life and the inevitable future. The characters in this series often face situations of repetition and endless effort, such as the main character of A Nice Place to Visit, 1960, which, after dying, discovers that he is trapped in an eternal cycle of his wishes fulfilled, but without real satisfaction. The character, like Sisyphus, is in a place that initially seems to be the solution to his problems, but soon realizes that he is caught in an endless cycle and that he will never find peace or rest. The myth of Sisyphus, in its multiple adaptations and references in popular culture, becomes a powerful symbol of human struggle against absurdity and existential frustration. Through the mentioned films and series, we see how the figure of Sisyphus is still relevant today, adapting to modern circumstances but maintaining its essence, the constant struggle, the incessant repetition, and the resistance to a destination that cannot be changed. In cinema and television, Sisyphus remains a figure that represents the struggle for meaning in a world that often seems to lack it, showing the universality of myth and its ability to transcend generations. The myth of Sisyphus, with its powerful image of hopeless struggle and resistance, has left a deep mark on various artistic fields, including music and theatre. Throughout the centuries, composers and playwrights have reinterpreted this myth, using their symbolism to explore human nature, the fight against the absurd, and the search for meaning. From classical music to contemporary theatre, Sisyphus is still a source of inspiration, a reminder of the eternal human struggle against the inevitable. In the world of classical music, one of the first composers to evoke the myth of Sisyphus was Igor Stravinsky. His work, La Seca du Printemps, 1913, although not based directly on Sisyphus, transmits an endless feeling of struggle. The frantic and repetitive rhythm of music reflects an effort without rest, similar to that of the mythological hero pushing the rock. In the piece, Stravinsky uses a complex rhythmic and melodic structure to create a sensation of constant struggle, of an energy that is not exhausted, but also does not lead to any clear resolution. The work becomes a metaphor of human effort to the inexplicable and the repetitive, a central theme in the figure of Sisyphus. Another composer who was inspired by Sisyphus's myth was Franz Liszt. In his work Sisyphus of the series of compositions Ans de Pèlerinage, Liszt uses a musical structure that reflects both the interior struggle of the character and the impossibility of reaching a goal. The piece, loaded with intense emotions and technical virtuosity, develops through great energy passages, alternating moments of despair with others of fleeting hope. The complexity and virtuosity of the work reflects the constant struggle of Sisyphus, which, although it strives, never achieves the top of the mountain. Music becomes a mirror of the myth, in which the beauty of interpretation contrasts with the frustration inherent in the character's destiny. The composer Olivier Messiaen, known for his deeply spiritual and philosophical compositions, also referred to the myth of Sisyphus in his work Sisyphus, which is part of his collection Vingt Regards à l'Encan Jesus. In this composition, Messiaen uses a complex harmony and a rhythm that creates the feeling of a perpetual struggle. Through music, it represents the impotence and frustration of the character, but also its resistance and its ability to persist in the face of eternity. The piece becomes a meditation on human suffering and the search for transcendence, just like myth itself. In contemporary music, the myth of Sisyphus has been used by several artists to address struggle, resistance, and the search for meaning in a chaotic world. The composer Philip Glass, known for his minimalist music, has explored topics related to repetition and endless struggle in works such as Einstein on the Beach, 1976. Although it is not based directly on the myth of Sisyphus, its music, which uses repetitive patterns and structures that develop slowly, can evoke the sensation of a constant effort without resolution. In this sense, Glass's work is a kind of musical tribute to the eternal return of Sisyphus, where the repetition of the reasons reflects the inability to escape the routine. In the theatre, Sisyphus's myth has been directly and symbolic in a wide variety of works. One of the most common approaches has been the use of myth as a metaphor for human struggle against absurd and inevitable, a central theme in existentialist dramaturgy. Jean-Paul Sartre, in his work La Nausée, 1938, although he does not explicitly add up to the myth, reflects the same feeling of existential struggle that Sisyphus experiences when facing the absurd. The work, full of anguish and despair, explores the existential vacuum of the human being, an issue that is deeply related to Sisyphus's conviction, who also faces a task without purpose or end. The playwright Samuel Beckett, known for his work Waiting for Godot, 1953, offers one of the theatre representations closest to the myth of Sisyphus. In this work, the two protagonists, Vladimir and Estragon, wait for a character named Godot who never arrives. This act of waiting, not knowing if one day it will be fulfilled, is analogous to Sisyphus's conviction, whose task seems endless and meaningless. Beckett's work reflects the absurdity of human existence, as if the characters were sentenced to an eternal wait, without a resolution or liberation. Although there is no rock to push, the feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle is clearly present at the Beckett Theatre, who was inspired by the existential vacuum that Sisyphus embodies. The playwright Eugene Ionesco, another exponent of the absurd theatre, was also influenced by Sisyphus's myth in works such as The Calver Singer, 1950. In this text, Ionesco presents an empty world of meaning, where the characters face the absurd repetition of their own existences. Although explicit reference to Sisyphus is not made, the work reflects a useless and repetitive struggle against the void, a feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle, similar to the task of pushing the rock. In contemporary theatre, the myth of Sisyphus has also been revisited in works that address human despair and the struggle to find meaning. The author David Ives, in his work All in the Timing, 1993, uses a structure of theatrical pieces that explore the concept of time and repetition, evoking the myth of Sisyphus through characters that are trapped in situations of repetitive and absurd cycles. Ives plays with the idea of eternity and futility, using humor and irony to explore how characters fight to find a purpose, although they never achieve it. The musical has also been a way in which the myth of Sisyphus has been reinterpreted. In the work Sisyphus, 2015, composed of the musician and composer Ramin Djawadi, the Sisyphus character is represented as a figure that, despite his suffering, continues to fight. Djawadi's music, known for its emotional and epic use, reflects the mountain that Sisyphus must climb again and again, with musical moments that reflect both despair and resilience. As in the opera or in the classical theatre, the myth of Sisyphus in the context of the musical becomes a lesson on human resistance to suffering. In the field of opera, composers such as Franz Schreker in his work Die Gezeichneten, 1918, have presented themes of struggle and condemnation that evoke the figure of Sisyphus. Although the opera plot is not based directly on the myth, the characters face a fight that seems eternal and unavoidable. Schreker's music, with his intense passages and his moments of great tension, captures the feeling of being trapped in an endless cycle, an issue that is closely related to Sisyphus' punishment. Through music and theatre, the myth of Sisyphus remains a rich source of inspiration to explore the human struggle against the absurd, repetition and endless suffering. Either through musical compositions that reflect the physical and emotional effort of the character or on the stage where repetition becomes a metaphor of life itself, the myth of Sisyphus continues to offer a deep reflection on human resistance and the search for meaning in a world that often seems not to offer answers. The myth of Sisyphus has transcended its origin in Greek mythology, becoming a powerful metaphor in modern psychology. the figure of Sisyphus, condemned to push a huge uphill rock only to see how it falls again and again, reflects many of the psychological challenges facing the human being: the fight against frustration, the meaning of the futility, existential despair, and the need to find meaning in life, even in the darkest moments. This myth has been used in various areas of psychology, from existential therapy to personal analysis, as a way of understanding internal conflicts and the nature of resistance to the inevitable. In existential psychology, the myth of Sisyphus has been interpreted as a representation of the human struggle against absurd. In his work The Myth of Sisyphus, the philosopher and writer Albert Camus analyzes the history of Sisyphus as a reflection of the existential vacuum, where human life, despite all the efforts to make sense, seems to be empty of purpose and constantly trapped in a repetition cycle. The rock that Sisyphus must push is an image of the existential burden that all human beings face at some point: the inevitable frustration, suffering, and hopeless struggle to achieve peace or lasting satisfaction. Camus, however, does not see this effort as useless. On the contrary, he argues that resistance and perseverance in the fight against absurd can be a source of meaning in themselves. For Camus, Sisyphus represents human rebellion to the absurd, the recognition that life does not have an intrinsic purpose, but still we cling to our ability to persist. This philosophical approach has been deeply integrated into existential therapy, a field of psychology that focuses on helping people face the existential dilemmas of life, such as meaning, death, freedom, and responsibility. In this context, the myth of Sisyphus can serve as a tool to help patients understand and accept the inevitability of certain aspects of life, such as suffering, repetition, and mortality. Existential therapy does not seek to avoid these challenges, but rather teach individuals to confront them directly and find their own meaning in them. Sisyphus' rock becomes a metaphor for human suffering and tasks that seem endless, but through their acceptance, individuals can find a way to transcend despair and existential vacuum. On the other hand, in humanistic psychotherapy, the myth of Sisyphus can be used to explore the internal resistance mechanisms that individuals have in front of their own emotional and psychological challenges. The figure of Sisyphus, caught in an endless cycle, reflects the struggle of many people against destructive thinking patterns, unresolved emotions, or repetitive behaviors that seem difficult to change. Humanist therapists, who focus on personal growth and self-realization, use the rock metaphor to work with patients to identify emotional or psychological blockages that keep them trapped in cycles of suffering. Through this process, patients can begin to understand their own internal struggles, which allows them to break those cycles and move towards greater authenticity and emotional well-being. In positive psychology, which focuses on the identification of personal strengths and the development of well-being, the myth of Sisyphus can be reinterpreted as an invitation to find meaning in the daily struggles of life. Although myth originally represents an effort that seems useless, positive psychology approaches suggest that Sisyphus, like anyone, can find meaning in their struggle. The practices of gratitude, mindfulness, and goals establishment can be tools that are used in the therapeutic context to help people find a purpose amid everyday difficulties. Like Sisyphus, people can learn to appreciate the resilience that emerges from the constant struggle, the force that develops when facing adversity without losing hope. The psychodynamic approach, focused on the analysis of unconscious conflicts and behavior patterns formed in childhood, can also use the myth of Sisyphus as a way to illustrate how people can be trapped in repetitive patterns of emotional self-harm. Often, these patterns are not aware and appear to be uncontrollable, as if the individual were pushing a rock uphill without being able to avoid it. In psychodynamic therapy, work consists in exploring these patterns and bringing to consciousness the underlying mechanisms that perpetuate them, which finally allows the patient to release the rock and break the cycle of suffering. The history of Sisyphus, in this sense, can serve as a metaphor of how unconscious patterns of defense and limiting beliefs keep us trapped in destructive cycles, and how, through self-knowledge and therapeutic work, it is possible to free themselves from these patterns and find greater internal peace. In addition, in cognitive behavioral therapy, TCC, the myth of Sisyphus can be used to illustrate how negative thinking patterns and irrational beliefs can lead to an endless feeling of struggle. Many people who suffer from anxiety or depression disorders may feel that their efforts to improve their life are useless, as a Sisyphus pushing their rock. Through cognitive restructuring, therapists work with patients to identify these dysfunctional thoughts and replace them with more realistic and constructive thinking patterns. The myth of Sisyphus becomes here a reminder that the internal struggle can be challenging, but that the key is not to avoid suffering, but to learn to change the way we respond to it. In a broader sense, the myth of Sisyphus has also been used in the transpersonal analysis, which addresses the potential to transcend the ego and achieve a higher state of consciousness. In this context, Sisyphus symbolizes the spiritual struggle to find a purpose beyond materialistic and everyday life. Through practices such as meditation, full attention, mindfulness, and the exploration of transcendental experiences, individuals can learn to see their suffering and their daily efforts not as futility, but as paths towards greater understanding and connection with the divine or the universal. The relevance of the myth of Sisyphus in modern psychology is undeniable. It serves as a powerful mirror of the internal struggle that we all face at some point in our lives. Whether it is the fight against anxiety, depression, destructive patterns of thought, or even confrontation with the deepest existential dilemmas, Sisyphus is a figure that resonates with the human experiences of struggle, resistance, and resilience. This myth not only invites us to reflect on our relationship with suffering, but also offers valuable lessons about how, even in the most difficult and apparently meaningless circumstances, we can find meaning and purpose in our persistence. The myth of Sisyphus has endured over the centuries because it touches an fib deep in human experience. In its essence, this ancient story not only deals with a man sentenced to endless punishment, but reflects a universal truth about the constant struggle we all face. The relevance of the myth today, despite the thousands of years after its origin, is undeniable. Sisyphus remains a figure that resonates in the context of our own efforts, frustrations, and the search for meaning in a world that often seems gloomy and absurd. Today, we live in an era of infinite demands and objectives that seem unattainable. The pressure to achieve success, to achieve always higher goals, for fulfilling social, family, and professional expectations, creates a panorama in which everyday life may seem an endless effort, as well as Sisyphus's task. The constant repetition of our activities, the effort cycles that seem to never lead to a definitive solution, remind us of this mythological king that, despite their perseverance, is caught in an eternal struggle. This parallel between myth and modern life is what maintains its resonance power over time, since it reflects the anguish of those who fight against what seems to be the inevitable: failure, frustration, emptiness. The myth of Sisyphus also touches deeply existential issues. In a society where quick responses and immediate solutions are sought at all costs, myth reminds us that life does not always have clear answers. The punishment of Sisyphus, without a final purpose beyond repetition, becomes a mirror of human struggle to find meaning amid chaos and uncertainty. Many times, we face the feeling that our efforts are futile, that our actions do not have the impact we want, or that the world simply follows its indifferent course to our aspirations. However, Sisyphus' resilience, its ability to resist adversity, becomes a metaphor of human tenacity. It is a reminder that, although our struggle does not always lead to the reward we imagine, our persistence is what our humanity defines. In addition, the myth of Sisyphus has a philosophical depth that remains of interest today. In his famous essay The Myth of Sisyphus, Albert Camus explores how this character embodies what he calls the absurd, that feeling of vacuum and disconnection between human expectations and the indifferent universe that surrounds us. However, Camus proposes that it is precisely in the acceptance of this absurdity where freedom is. The figure of Sisyphus, not giving in to despair, but by accepting its destiny and continuing to push the rock, becomes a symbol of resistance, not in the face of the task itself, but against the absurd itself of life. At present, this reflection is crucial in a world full of uncertainties, where people fight with the meaning of life, purpose, and the search for their place in a universe that seems often not having answers. The myth also remains relevant because it reflects the struggle to find meaning in suffering. In modern times, where mental illnesses, stress, and anxiety are increasingly common, Sisyphus's myth offers us a way to understand how we interact with suffering. While the myth shows Sisyphus as a man who seems convicted of endless effort, he also suggests that, by accepting that conviction, a form of dignity can be found. It is a way to face suffering not from surrender, but from active resistance. At a time when many people feel that their efforts are useless, the myth suggests that perseverance itself can have an inherent value, even if there is no definitive reward at the end of the road. The myth has also adapted to contemporary contexts, providing a way to reflect on the collective challenges we face as a society. In the field of politics, economy, the environment and other great social problems, Sisyphus becomes a metaphor of human efforts against global challenges that seem impossible to overcome. The climatic crisis, for example, is a contemporary example of the rock that current generations have to push again and again, with the feeling that each small advance is followed by setbacks. And yet, persistence remains crucial. As Sisyphus, humanity must continue to fight, not because the task is easy or fast to achieve, but because, in doing so, it maintains hope and struggle for a better future. In modern psychology, myth has been used to understand the internal struggle of people who face mental illnesses, such as depression or anxiety. These conditions can feel like a rock immovable that must be pushed every day, an emotional burden that never disappears. However, like Sisyphus, people can find a way of making sense of their suffering and, instead of surrendering, finding strength in their resistance. Therapists can use myth as a powerful metaphor to help patients understand that, although their struggle is constant and difficult, the process of confronting adversity can be a source of personal growth and self-understanding. In popular culture, Sisyphus is still a powerful figure in music, cinema, literature, and art. Many songs, movies, and modern novels explore the concept of endless struggle, of efforts that seem to never come to an end. The myth adapts to contemporary challenges, reflecting both disappointment and human resilience. In this context, Sisyphus remains a relevant character, a symbol of fighting the impossible and a representation of the tireless search for meaning, even when there seems to be no reward. In short, the immortality of Sisyphus' myth lies in its ability to capture a fundamental truth about human experience. The struggle, frustration, perseverance, and the search for meaning are issues that remain as relevant today as they were in ancient Greece. Sisyphus, far from being a simple mythological character, has become a universal symbol of the human condition, of our resistance to adversities, and of the eternal search for purpose in a world that sometimes seems to offer more questions than answers. Sisyphus, the cunning king of Ephyra, is one of the most complex and fascinating characters of Greek mythology. Its history is marked by deception, excessive ambition, and resistance that seems not to know limits. Throughout his life, Sisyphus faced gods and mortals equally, with such an acute ingenuity that he was able to deceive even the same divine powers. However, its history is not limited to its cunning maneuvers, but also offers us deep lessons about human behavior, the struggle for power, and the consequences of our actions. Through his life, we can learn about cunning, ambition, and resistance in a way that continues to resonate in contemporary humanity. From his childhood, Sisyphus showed an unusual intelligence. He was a child whose cunning ingenuity differentiated him from others, and this ability accompanied him throughout his life. In a world where physical strength and war were fundamental to reaching power, Sisyphus understood that its true weapon was the mind. Throughout his reign, he used this cunning to build his empire in Ephyra, which would later be Corinth, governing with great skill. In their time, the gods were not easily challengeable, but Sisyphus learned that, although divinities could be more powerful, deception was an equally effective way to obtain what I wanted. In this sense, Sisyphus teaches us a fundamental lesson about the importance of cunning. We live in a world where the ability to think and act intelligence can be more powerful than simple force. In many situations, mental speed and the ability to manipulate the circumstances in our favor are those that make a difference. Sisyphus was a teacher in the art of manipulating those around him, using his cunning to obtain valuable information and to make others lean before his will. In his relationship with the gods, for example, he challenged his authority not with weapons, but with carefully planned deception. Each of his actions was motivated by the idea that, in a world ruled by almighty beings, cunning was the only way mortals could survive and prosper. However, Sisyphus' lesson is not limited to strategic intelligence, it is also deeply linked to ambition. Sisyphus was never satisfied with what I had. His ambition had no break, and his desire for power led him to challenge Zeus and, therefore, the gods of Olympus themselves. In the end, his life was an illustration of how ambition can cloud the trial and lead people to make impulsive decisions that alter their destinations irreversibly. In his eagerness to gain more power and control, Sisyphus faced his own limit. He could not escape the consequences of his actions. Its history is a warning about the dangers of excessive ambition, a lesson that remains relevant today, in an era where the desire to achieve success often leads people to lose their ethics and principles. However, Sisyphus' deeper lesson may be resistance. Although his cunning and ambition led him to commit acts that challenged the divine laws, it was his ability to resist what made him truly memorable. Sisyphus never surrendered, even when his punishment was clear and inevitable. Despite being condemned to push a rock uphill for all eternity, just to see how it fell again before reaching the top, never gave in to despair. The image of Sisyphus fighting again and again against the impossible, without giving up, has become a symbol of human resistance to adversity. The lesson here is clear: it does not matter how overwhelming the circumstances are, which really defines a person is their ability to move forward, to continue fighting even when everything seems to be against him. In modern life, this type of resistance is more relevant than ever. We face obstacles that seem insurmountable, from emotional difficulties to existential crises, from professional failures to personal losses. Sisyphus, in its eternal struggle, teaches us that resistance is not always about obtaining a definitive victory, but about the ability to get up again and again, to persevere even when the goal seems to be out of our reach. His eternal punishment, although apparently useless, has an intrinsic lesson about the nature of resistance. Sometimes, the fight itself is what gives meaning to our existence. It is also important to recognize that Sisyphus, being a mortal who faced the gods, represents the fight against superior forces, those that seem to be out of our control. Today, people face invisible and overwhelming forces, social systems, cultural expectations, economic and political pressures. Sisyphus teaches us that, although these forces can be irresistible, our response to them is what our humanity really defines. The fact that Sisyphus, even when you know that your effort will not lead anywhere, continues to push the rock, shows us that our true victory lies in the ability not to give in to those external forces. Like him, many times our value lies in our will to move forward, even when we do not see the end of the fight. More philosophical, Sisyphus also leaves us a lesson about acceptance. In his eternal punishment, he does not limit himself to resisting the burden bitter, but comes to accept his destiny. This acceptance of the inescapable is a lesson that many can apply to their own life. Sometimes, our circumstances are immutable, and the greatest act of resistance is to learn to accept what we cannot change. Acceptance is not a surrender, but a way of finding peace in the fight itself. Like Sisyphus, we can find meaning in our own struggles, even when we know that there will be no clear end or final victory. When looking at the history of Sisyphus, we see that his life is marked by cunning, ambition and resistance. Although his path is full of deceptions and betrayals, what really defines it is his ability to continue fighting, despite the apparent uselessness of his task. Somehow, Sisyphus teaches us that true value is not found in immediate achievements, but in persistence and resistance to the greatest challenges that life holds us. Imagine for a moment that the rock that Sisyphus is condemned to push forever is not only a weight, a punishment, but a symbol of something much deeper: hope. In the midst of the endless and apparently useless fight, there is a spark that can be found. The rock, in this sense, could represent the constant opportunity of renewal, the possibility of restarting again and again, despite the adversities. Sisyphus's conviction, far from being just a punishment, becomes a powerful lesson about perseverance and unwavering struggle to find a purpose, even when everything seems to be against. The myth of Sisyphus can be interpreted optimistically if we focus on what he does with his time, in the way he faces the immutable. Instead of surrendering to the absurdity of his task, Sisyphus continues to pushing the rock. This action, repeated over and over again, reflects an attitude towards life that is deeply human, the ability to continue fighting, to get up after each fall. Hope does not reside in reaching the top, nor in the culmination of the task, but in simple persistence, in the fact of not ceasing to fight. Sisyphus shows us that, even when the circumstances are discouraging, we can find meaning in constant action, in continuous effort. Every time the rock falls, Sisyphus has the opportunity to start over. Although it never reaches the top, the constant renewal of its effort can be seen as a reminder that in life, every day it is a new opportunity. Difficulties, instead of being an impassable obstacle, are a continuous cycle in which life itself takes shape. The simple fact that Sisyphus returns to the load, again and again, gives meaning to its existence. It is not destiny that defines his life, but the daily decision to continue. In fact, the same fact that Sisyphus is sentenced to this eternal effort could be seen as proof of its infinite resistance capacity. The gods have condemned it, but at the same time, they have granted the strength to continue pushing the rock. This suggests that within us, even in the face of adversity, there is always a force that drives us to move forward. Hope is not to change the course of events, but how we chose to face them. Each thrust of the rock is a small personal victory, a reaffirmation of human capacity to follow, regardless of external circumstances. The rock, then, can also be interpreted as a symbol of personal growth. While Sisyphus' punishment is eternal and repetitive, the same repetition can be seen as a continuous process form. Like human effort, the rock can be a symbol of the challenges we constantly face, but also, over time, they teach us important lessons. Throughout life, we face obstacles that seem to have no end, but with each challenge, we gain something, even if it is small. Like Sisyphus, we can learn that the key is not to reach the top, but in how we face the challenges, how we strive and evolve while we face them. One of the most optimistic interpretations is that the rock represents the possibility of transformation. If Sisyphus continues to push the rock, more and more effort, it could conclude that the true task is not to reach the top, but to transform its experience into a dignified form of resistance. In his efforts, Sisyphus has the opportunity to dominate the task. The punishment becomes, then, a form of self-survey. His fight defines him, not because he succeeds, but because he never stops trying. This teaches us that often what really matters is not to achieve success in conventional terms, but the transformation we experience while we strive. The hope that Sisyphus can find in its eternal effort is, therefore, hope in the process, on the journey itself. Each thrust of the rock is an act of courage, a reminder that the important thing is not to give up, not yield to the temptation of despair. Sisyphus, in his eternity, is not only condemned to punishment, but has the opportunity to find peace in the fight itself. Finally, the rock can also symbolize the inevitability of the challenges of life. We cannot avoid the obstacles that life presents to us. However, Sisyphus teaches us to embrace the rock, to accept challenges as an integral part of our existence. In doing so, we find a source of unwavering hope, the belief that, even when everything seems to be against us, the simple act of moving forward is in itself a victory. Life is not always about tangible success, but about the way we face what is presented to us. Sisyphus is a figure that, although apparently condemned, finds a type of greatness in its resistance, a type of hope that is sustained, not in the future, but in the now. In summary, Sisyphus's condemnation to push the rock forever, far from being meaningless punishment, can be seen as a deep representation of human resistance, the ability to find hope in the midst of constant struggle. The rock is not only a weight, but a symbol of renewal, resilience, and the ability to find meaning in daily effort. In a world where difficulties seem endless, the history of Sisyphus invites us to see that, sometimes, true victory is to continue fighting again and again, regardless of how unsuccessful the effort may seem. The myth of Sisyphus, condemned to push its rock forever, is a story that has transcended time, a story that continues to resonate with humanity through the centuries. As we move around the 21st century and beyond, the figure of Sisyphus and his conviction could evolve in surprising ways, acquiring new meanings and relevance in a modern and future context. The unwavering Sisyphus struggle could become a symbol of the difficulties and challenges of our time, adapting to the problems of the present and, possibly, projecting towards a future where resistance and persistence are more necessary than nuance. Today, in the 21st century, we face complex global challenges, climate crisis, economic inequality, geopolitical tensions, and the vertiginous advance of technology. These problems often seem to be unsurpassed mountains, and the effort to solve them can feel as unattainable as Sisyphus's purpose. In this context, myth could be reconfigured to symbolize not only the individual struggle, but also collective efforts to face great crises. Sisyphus' rock could be interpreted as a symbol of the tireless efforts of people and communities to face global adversities, from climate change to the eradication of poverty. In the 21st century, Sisyphus's myth could find its place in the struggles against systems that seem immovable, such as political and economic structures that perpetuate social injustice. In this interpretation, Sisyphus would be the figure that challenges the system, which fights for a greater cause, although it seems that its efforts do not always bear immediate fruits. In a world where social inequalities seem to be rooted in the structures of society, Sisyphus can represent the activist, the tireless worker, the fighter who persists in his efforts to achieve a change, although the victories seem distant or unattainable. Technology also plays a key role in our vision of the future, and with it comes a new form of rock for humanity. Technology, although it offers innumerable benefits, also imposes difficult challenges to anticipate: the automation of work, the struggle for privacy, artificial intelligence that redefines our labor and social relations. In this context, Sisyphus' rock could symbolize tensions between progress and human impact. Is humanity condemned to push forward in an increasingly automated world, without escaping the consequences of the technological revolution? The future could see Sisyphus as a figure that represents our constant struggle to find a balance between technological progress and the need to maintain our humanity, despite the advances that change our way of living. In the future beyond the 21st century, the myth could acquire a completely different dimension, especially if humanity evolves towards a more interconnected model and perhaps more dependent on artificial intelligence and biotechnology. Here, Sisyphus' rock could become a metaphor of the struggle to preserve human autonomy in a world of growing technological control. If advances in biotechnology, neuroscience, and cybernetics manage to radically modify the human body and mind, Sisyphus could become a symbol of resistance to loss of human essence. Instead of being a simple punishment figure, he could represent humanity itself struggling to maintain its freedom, its identity, and its purpose in the midst of a technological evolution that threatens to dilute everything that defines it. In addition, the future could see the myth of Sisyphus as a symbol of collective fatigue in an era of information, stress, and anxiety overload. In a world where everyday life has become faster, more interconnected, and, sometimes, more alienating, Sisyphus' rock could be interpreted as the burden of excessive consumption, of the expectations of success, of the pressure to be kept updated or relevant. Sisyphus' sentence would be transformed, then, into a metaphor of our daily struggle to find purpose in the midst of computer chaos and the constant demands of modern society. Every day, we push the rock of our responsibilities, but what is the meaning of all this in a world where speed seems to be the measure of success? However, in the 21st century and beyond, a more hopeful vision of myth could also arise, especially if we consider the growth of movements for social justice, environmental sustainability, and global cooperation. Sisyphus, in this case, could become a figure that, although it continues to face an endless challenge, looks like a symbol of collective resilience. Instead of being convicted only to useless effort, Sisyphus could represent the generations that fight for a better future, not only for themselves, but for the planet and the generations to come. In this context, the rock is not only a burden, but a symbol of struggle for something worthwhile, despite the difficulty or inevitability of failure. The hope here lies in the idea that, although progress can be slow and the victories not always visible, the collective effort has a transformative power, a power that can last far beyond individual efforts. As for visual and cultural representation, Sisyphus's myth in the future could evolve through of new media forms, such as video games, virtual reality, or interactive narratives. Imagine a futuristic video game where players embody Sisyphus, facing apparently infinite challenges, but with the possibility of finding moments of deep reflection in the midst of the fight. Instead of being just an endless punishment, Sisyphus in this context could represent the player who, despite repeated defeats, continues to try again and again, reflecting the nature of life itself, a series of attempts, learning, and reign tense. In the literary and cinematographic future, myth could adapt to explore new dimensions of human resistance to power systems, social inequality, and technological advances. We could see Sisyphus as a protagonist who does not give up, who finds ways to resist even when the probabilities are completely against him. In this future, the rock could be digital, representing the burden of technological decisions that model human destiny, or it could be a metaphor of social struggles that are still to be resolved. In summary, Sisyphus' myth will remain relevant because, like the rocks he pushes, there will always be something that challenges humanity, something that makes us move forward, although we do not always see the end. In the 21st century and beyond, this myth could evolve not only as a history of punishment, but as a powerful narrative about the struggle for hope, meaning, and resistance to an uncertain future. The rock is not just a burden, it is a continuous proof of the human determination of persisting, of learning and finding, despite everything, a purpose on the road. In every corner of human history, in each struggle, every failure, and every small triumph, the myth of Sisyphus stands as a mirror in which we are reflected. Sisyphus, the king who challenged the gods and challenged death itself, condemned to an eternal and useless effort, is not just a figure of Greek mythology. It is, in a way, all of us. Every time we face a challenge that seems insurmountable, every time we get up after a fall, and every time we move on despite adversity, we are Sisyphus. Its history is ours. Sisyphus's condemnation to push his rock to the top of a mountain just to see how he falls again is more than a simple fable about resistance. It is an eternal lesson about the very nature of human life. We live in a world that often seems to be full of endless obstacles, where effort does not always have a tangible reward. However, the history of Sisyphus does not invite us to surrender to the inevitable defeat, but to understand that the fight itself has value. It is in that effort, in that persistence, where it resides what makes us human. Each of us, like Sisyphus, faces a path full of stones that we must move, again and again. Life is not always about reaching the top, but about continuing the path, of persevere even when the goal seems unattainable. Sisyphus, despite his conviction, never leaves his task. It shows us that true value does not lie in success or failure, but in the ability to move forward. And in this sense, its history is not only a story of frustration, but of hope. Because, although the rock will always fall, the act of raising it again is an affirmation that, as long as we continue fighting, there will always be a purpose, there will always be a reason to continue. In the repetition of the task, Sisyphus finds a form of freedom, a way of making sense of its existence. You may never see the end, but the path itself becomes its purpose. This myth thus becomes a testament of the human spirit. Sisyphus' rock represents all those tests, large and small, which challenge us every day. And although we do not always understand the purpose behind our struggles, the myth reminds us that the value is not always in the final goal, but in the way we face the challenges. Because, in the end, what defines our humanity is not the rock we push, but the determination with which we move on, day after day, hoping that, one day, all the effort will have been worth it. Through generations, the myth of Sisyphus has been a mirror of our own lives, with its constant increases and falls. And, in that reflection, we continue to see our own struggle and resistance. Sisyphus' story continues to speak to us, reminding us that, although fate is uncertain and inexhaustible challenges, the will to continue will always be our greatest strength. As Sisyphus, we continue to push our rocks, finding in each movement, in each renewed effort, a reason to continue believing in ourselves and in the power of human resistance.